Chapter 9. The Man in Spectacles. Burgundy is a jolly thing, said the professor sadly as he set his glass down. You don't look as if it were, said Syme. You drink it as if it were medicine. You must excuse my manner, said the professor dismally. My position is rather a curious one. Inside I am really bursting with boyish merriment, but I acted the paralytic professor so well that now I can't leave off, so that when I am among friends and have no need at all to disguise myself, I still can't help speaking slow and wrinkling my forehead, just as if it were my forehead. I can be quite happy, you understand, but only in a paralytic sort of way. The most buoyant exclamations leap up in my heart, but they come out of my mouth quite different. You should hear me say, "Buck up, old cock." It would bring tears to your eyes. It does, said Syme, but I cannot help thinking that apart from all that you are really a bit worried. The professor started a little and looked at him steadily. You are a very clever fellow, he said. It is a pleasure to work with you. Yes, I have rather a heavy cloud in my head. There is a great problem to face, and he sank his bald brow in his two hands. Then he said in a low voice, "Can you play the piano?" "Yes," said Syme in simple wonder. "I'm supposed to have a good touch." Then, as the other did not speak, he added, "I trust the great cloud is lifted." After a long silence, the professor said out of the cavernous shadow of his hands, "It would have done just as well if you could work a typewriter." "Thank you," said Syme. "You flatter me." "Listen to me," said the other, "and remember whom we have to see tomorrow. You and I are going tomorrow to attempt something which is very much more dangerous than trying to steal the crown jewels out of the tower. We are trying to steal a secret from a very sharp, very strong, and very wicked man. I believe there is no man, except the president, of course, who is so seriously startling and formidable as that little grinning fellow in goggles. He has not perhaps the white-hot enthusiasm unto death, the mad martyrdom for anarchy, which marks the secretary, but then that very fanaticism in the secretary has a human pathos and is almost a redeeming trait. But the little doctor has a brutal sanity that is more shocking than the secretary's disease. Don't you notice his detestable virility and vitality? He bounces like an India rubber ball. Depend on it, Sunday was not asleep. I wonder if he ever sleeps. When he locked up all the plans of this outrage in the round, black head of Dr. Ball. "And you think," said Syme, "that this unique monster will be soothed if I play the piano to him?" "Don't be an ass," said his mentor. "I mentioned the piano because it gives one quick and independent fingers. Syme, if we are to go through this interview and come out sane or alive, we must have some code of signals between us that this brute will not see. I have made a rough alphabetical cipher corresponding to the 5 fingers, like this, C, and he rippled with his fingers on the wooden table, B a D, bad, a word we may frequently require." Syme poured himself out another glass of wine and began to study the scheme. He was abnormally quick with his brains at puzzles and with his hands at conjuring, and it did not take him long to learn how he may convey simple messages by what would seem to be idle taps upon a table or knee. But wine and companionship had always the effect of inspiring him to a farcical ingenuity, and the professor soon found himself struggling with the too vast energy of the new language as it passed through the heated brain of Syme. "We must have several word signs," said Syme seriously, "words that we are likely to want, fine shades of meaning. My favorite word is coeval. What's yours?" "Do stop playing the goat," said the professor plaintively. "You don't know how serious this is." "Lush too," said Syme, shaking his head sagaciously. "We must have lush, word applied to grass, don't you know?" "Do you imagine," asked the professor furiously, "that we are going to talk to Dr. Bull about grass?" "There are several ways in which the subject could be approached," said Syme reflectively, and the word introduced without appearing forced. We may say, Dr. Bull, as a revolutionist, you remember that a tyrant once advised us to eat grass, and truly many of us, looking on the fresh, lush grass of summer. Do you understand, said the other, that this is a tragedy? Perfectly, replied Syme. Always be comic in a tragedy. What the deuce else can you do? I wish this language of yours had a wider scope. I suppose we could not extend it from the fingers to the toes? That would involve pulling off our boots and socks during the conversation, which, however unobtrusively performed. Syme, said his friend with a stern simplicity, go to bed. Syme, however, sat up in bed for a considerable time mastering the new code. He was awakened next morning, while the east was still sealed with darkness, and found his gray-bearded ally standing like a ghost beside his bed. Syme sat up in bed blinking, then slowly collected his thoughts, threw off the bedclothes, and stood up. It seemed to him in some curious way that all the safety and sociability of the night before fell with the bedclothes off him, and he stood up in an air of cold danger. He still felt an entire trust and loyalty towards his companion, but it was the trust between two men going to the scaffold. Well, said Syme with a forced cheerfulness as he pulled on his trousers, I dreamt of that alphabet of yours. Did it take you long to make it up? The professor made no answer, but gazed in front of him with eyes the color of a wintry sea. So Syme repeated his question. I say, did it take you long to invent all this? I'm considered good at these things, and it was a good hour's grind. Did you learn it all on the spot? The professor was silent. His eyes were wide open, and he wore a fixed but very small smile. How long did it take you? The professor did not move. Confound you, can't you answer? Called out Syme, in a sudden anger that had something like fear underneath. Whether or no the professor could answer, he did not. Syme stood staring back at the stiff face like parchment and the blank blue eyes. His first thought was that the professor had gone mad, but his second thought was more frightful. After all, what did he know about this queer creature whom he had heedlessly accepted as a friend? What did he know, except that the man had been at the anarchist breakfast and had told him a ridiculous tale? How improbable it was that there should be another friend there beside Gogol. Was this man's silence a sensational way of declaring war? Was this adamantine stare after all only the awful sneer of some threefold traitor who had turned for the last time? He stood and strained his ears in this heartless silence. He almost fancied he could hear dynamiters come to capture him shifting softly in the corridor outside. Then his eye strayed downwards, and he burst out laughing, though the professor himself stood there as voiceless as a statue. His 5 dumb fingers were dancing alive upon the dead table. Syme watched the twinkling movements of the talking hand and read clearly the message. I will only talk like this. We must get used to it. He rapped out the answer with the impatience of relief. All right, let's get out to breakfast. They took their hats and sticks in silence, but as Syme took his sword stick, he held it hard. They paused for a few minutes only to stuff down coffee and coarse thick sandwiches at a coffee stall, and then made their way across the river, which under the gray and growing light looked as desolate as Akron. They reached the bottom of the huge block of buildings which they had seen from across the river and began in silence to mount the naked and numberless stone steps, only pausing now and then to make short remarks on the rail of the banisters. At about every other flight they passed a window. Each window showed them a pale and tragic dawn lifting itself laboriously over London. From each the innumerable roofs of slate looked like the leaden surges of a gray, troubled sea after rain. Syme was increasingly conscious that his new adventure had somehow a quality of cold sanity worse than the wild adventures of the past. Last night, for instance, the tall tenements had seemed to him like a tower in a dream. As he now went up the weary and perpetual steps, he was daunted and bewildered by their almost infinite series. But it was not the hot horror of a dream or of anything that may be exaggeration or delusion. Their infinity was more like the empty infinity of arithmetic, something unthinkable, yet necessary to thought, or it was like the stunning statements of astronomy about the distance of the fixed stars. He was ascending the house of reason, a thing more hideous than unreason itself. By the time they reached Dr. Bull's landing, a last window showed them a harsh, white dawn edged with banks of a kind of coarse red, more like red clay than red cloud. And when they entered Dr. Bull's bare garret, it was full of light. Syme had been haunted by a half-historic memory in connection with these empty rooms and that austere daybreak. The moment he saw the garret and Dr. Bull sitting writing at a table, he remembered what the memory was: the French Revolution. There should have been the black outline of a guillotine against that heavy red and white of the morning. Dr. Paul was in his white shirt and black breeches only. His cropped, dark head may well have just come out of its wig. He may have been Marat or a more slipshod Robespierre. Yet when he was seen properly, the French fancy fell away. The Jacobins were idealists. There was about this man a murderous materialism. His position gave him a somewhat new appearance. The strong, white light of morning coming from one side, creating sharp shadows, made him seem both more pale and more angular than he had looked at the breakfast on the balcony. Thus the two black glasses that encased his eyes may really have been black cavities in his skull, making him look like a death's head. And, truly, if ever Death himself sat writing at a wooden table, it may have been he. He looked up and smiled brightly enough as the men came in, and rose, with the resilient rapidity of which the professor had spoken. He set chairs for both of them, and going to a peg behind the door, proceeded to put on a coat and waistcoat of rough, dark tweed. He buttoned it up neatly and came back to sit down at his table. The quiet good humor of his manner left his two opponents helpless. It was with some momentary difficulty that the professor broke silence and began. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, comrade," said he, with a careful resumption of the slow de Worms manner. "You have no doubt made all the arrangements for the Paris affair." Then he added with infinite slowness, "We have information which renders intolerable anything in the nature of a moment's delay." Dr. Bull smiled again, but continued to gaze on them without speaking. The professor resumed, a pause before each weary word. "Please do not think me excessively abrupt, but I advise you to alter those plans, or if it is too late for that, to follow your agent with all the support you can get for him. Comrade Syme and I have had an experience which it would take more time to recount than we can afford, if we are to act on it. I will, however, relate the occurrence in detail, evening at the risk of losing time, if you really feel that it is essential to the understanding of the problem we have to discuss." He was spinning out his sentences, making them intolerably long and lingering, in the hope of maddening the practical little doctor into an explosion of impatience which may show his hand. But the little doctor continued only to stare and smile, and the monologue was a pill work. Syme began to feel a new sickness and despair. The doctor's smile and silence were not at all like the cataleptic stare and horrible silence which he had confronted in the professor half an hour before. About the professor's makeup and all his antics there was always something merely grotesque, like a gollywog. Syme remembered those wild woes of yesterday, as one remembers being afraid of bogey in childhood. But here was daylight. Here was a healthy, square-shouldered man in tweeds, not odd, save for the accident of his ugly spectacles, not glaring or grinning at all, but smiling steadily and not saying a word. The whole had a sense of unbearable reality. Under the increasing sunlight, the colors of the doctor's complexion, the pattern of his tweeds, grew and expanded outrageously, as such things grow too important in a realistic novel. But his smile was quite slight, the pose of his head polite. The only uncanny thing was his silence. As I say, resumed the professor, like a man toiling through heavy sand, the incident that has occurred to us and has led us to ask for information about the Marquis is one which you may think it better to have narrated. But as it came in the way of Comrade Syme rather than me, his words he seemed to be dragging out like words in an anthem. But Syme, who was watching, saw his long fingers rattle quickly on the edge of the crazy table. He read the message, "You must go on. This devil has sucked me dry." Syme plunged into the breach with that bravado of improvisation which always came to him when he was alarmed. "Yes, the thing really happened to me," he said hastily. "I had the good fortune to fall into conversation with a detective who took me, thanks to my hat, for a respectable person. Wishing to clinch my reputation for respectability, I took him and made him very drunk at the Savoy. Under this influence he became friendly, and told me in so many words that within a day or two they hope to arrest the Marquis in France. So unless you or I can get on his track," the doctor was still smiling in the most friendly way, and his protected eyes were still impenetrable. The professor signaled to Syme that he would resume his explanation, and he began again with the same elaborate calm. "Syme immediately brought this information to me, and we came here together to see what use you would be inclined to make of it. It seems to me unquestionably urgent." That all this time Syme had been staring at the doctor almost as steadily as the doctor stared at the professor, but quite without the smile. The nerves of both comrades in arms were near snapping under that strain of motionless amiability, when Syme suddenly leant forward and idly tapped the edge of the table. His message to his ally ran, "I have an intuition." The professor, with scarcely a pause in his monologue, signaled back, "Then sit on it." Syme telegraphed, "It is quite extraordinary." The other answered, "Extraordinary rot." Syme said, "I am a poet." The other retorted, "You are a dead man." Syme had gone quite red up to his yellow hair, and his eyes were burning feverishly. As he said he had an intuition, and it had risen to a sort of light-headed certainty. Resuming his symbolic taps, he signaled to his friend, "You scarcely realize how poetic my intuition is. It has that sudden quality we sometimes feel in the coming of spring." He then studied the answer on his friend's fingers. The answer was, "Go to hell." The professor then resumed his merely verbal monologue addressed to the doctor. "Perhaps I should rather say," said Syme on his fingers, "that it resembles that sudden smell of the sea which may be found in the heart of lush woods." His companion disdained to reply, or yet again tapped Syme. "It is positive, as is the passionate red hair of a beautiful woman." The professor was continuing his speech, but in the middle of it Syme decided to act. He leant across the table and said in a voice that could not be neglected, "Dr. Bull." The doctor's sleek and smiling head did not move, but they could have sworn that under his dark glasses his eyes darted towards Syme. "Dr. Bull," said Syme, in a voice peculiarly precise and courteous, "would you do me a small favor? Would you be so kind as to take off your spectacles?" The professor swung round on his seat and stared at Syme with a sort of frozen fury of astonishment. Syme, like a man who has thrown his life and fortune on the table, leaned forward with a fiery face. The doctor did not move. For a few seconds there was a silence in which one could hear a pin drop, split once by the single hoot of a distant steamer on the Thames. Then Dr. Bull rose slowly, still smiling, and took off his spectacles. Syme sprang to his feet, stepping backwards a little, like a chemical lecturer from a successful explosion. His eyes were like stars, and for an instant he could only point without speaking. The professor had also started to his feet, forgetful of his supposed paralysis. He leant on the back of the chair and stared doubtfully at Dr. Bull, as if the doctor had been turned into a toad before his eyes. And truly it was almost as great a transformation scene. The two detectives saw sitting in the chair before them a very boyish-looking young man, with very frank and happy hazel eyes, an open expression, cockney clothes like those of a city clerk, and an unquestionable breath about him of being very good and rather commonplace. The smile was still there, but it may have been the first smile of a baby. "I knew I was a poet," cried Syme in a sort of ecstasy. "I knew my intuition was as infallible as the Pope. It was the spectacles that did it. It was all the spectacles. Given those beastly black eyes and all the rest of him, his health and his jolly looks made him a live devil among dead ones." "It certainly does make a queer difference," said the professor shakily. "But as regards the project of Dr. Bull—" "Project be damned," roared Syme, beside himself. "Look at him. Look at his face. Look at his collar. Look at his blessed boots. You don't suppose, do you, that thing's an anarchist?" "Syme!" cried the other in an apprehensive agony. "Why, by God," said Syme, "I'll take the risk of that myself. Dr. Bull, I am a police officer. There's my card," and he flung down the blue card upon the table. The professor still feared that all was lost, but he was loyal. He pulled out his own official card and put it beside his friend's. Then the third man burst out laughing, and for the first time that morning, they heard his voice. "I'm awfully glad you chaps have come so early," he said, with a sort of schoolboy flippancy, "for we can all start for France together. Yes, I'm in the force right enough." And he flicked a blue card towards them, lightly as a matter of form, clapping a brisk bowler on his head and resuming his goblin glasses. The doctor moved so quickly towards the door that the others instinctively followed him. Syme seemed a little distrait, and as he passed under the doorway he suddenly struck his stick on the stone passage so that it rang. "But Lord God Almighty," he cried out, "if this is all right, there were more damned detectives than there were damned dynamiters at the damned council." "We may have fought easily," said Bull. "We were 4 against 3. The professor was descending the stairs, but his voice came up from below. "No," said the voice, "we were not 4 against 3. We were not so lucky. We were 4 against 1. The others went down the stairs in silence. The young man called Bull, with an innocent courtesy characteristic of him, insisted on going last until they reached the street. But there his own robust rapidity asserted itself unconsciously, and he walked quickly on ahead towards a railway inquiry office, talking to the others over his shoulder. "It is jolly to get some pals," he said. "I've been half dead with the jumps being quite alone." I nearly flung my arms round Gogol and embraced him, which would have been imprudent. "I hope you won't despise me for having been in a blue funk." "All the blue devils in blue hell," said Syme, "contributed to my blue funk. But the worst devil was you and your infernal goggles." The young man laughed delightedly. "Wasn't it a rag?" he said. "Such a simple idea, not my own. I haven't got the brains. You see, I wanted to go into the detective service, especially the anti-dynamite business. But for that purpose they wanted someone to dress up as a dynamiter, and they all swore by blazes that I could never look like a dynamiter. They said my very walk was respectable, and that seen from behind I looked like the British Constitution. They said I looked too healthy, and too optimistic, and too reliable and benevolent. They called me all sorts of names at Scotland Yard. They said that if I had been a criminal, I may have made my fortune by looking so like an honest man. But as I had the misfortune to beat an honest man, there was not even the remotest chance of my assisting them by ever looking like a criminal. But at last I was brought before some old josser who was high up in the force, and who seemed to have no end of a head on his shoulders. And there the others all talked hopelessly One asked whether a bushy beard would hide my nice smile. Another said that if they blacked my face I may look like a Negro anarchist, but this old chap chipped in with a most extraordinary remark. A pair of smoked spectacles will do it, he said positively. Look at him now. He looks like an angelic office boy. Put him on a pair of smoked spectacles and children will scream at the sight of him. And so it was, by George, when once my eyes were covered, all the rest, smile and big shoulders and short hair, made me look a perfect little devil. As I say, it was simple enough when it was done, like miracles. But that wasn't the really miraculous part of it. There was one really staggering thing about the business, and my head still turns at it. What was that? Asked Syme. I'll tell you, answered the man in spectacles. This big pot in the police, who sized me up so that he knew how the goggles would go with my hair and socks. By God, he never saw me at all. Syme's eyes suddenly flashed on him. How was that? He asked. I thought you talked to him. So I did, said Bull brightly, but we talked in a pitch-dark room like a coal cellar. There, you would never have guessed that. I could not have conceived it, said Syme gravely. It is truly a new idea, said the professor. Their new ally was in practical matters a whirlwind. At the inquiry office he asked with businesslike brevity about the trains for Dover. Having got his information, he bundled the company into a cab and put them and himself inside a railway carriage before they had properly realized the breathless process. They were already on the Calais boat before conversation flowed freely. I had already arranged, he explained, to go to France for my lunch, but I am delighted to have someone to lunch with me. You see, I had to send that beast, the Marquis, over with his bomb because the president had his eye on me, though God knows how. I'll tell you the story some day. It was perfectly choking. Whenever I tried to slip out of it I saw the president somewhere, smiling out of the bow window of a club, or taking off his hat to me from the top of an omnibus. I tell you, you can say what you like. That fellow sold himself to the devil. He can be in 6 places at once. So you sent the Marquis off, I understand, asked the professor. Was it long ago? Shall we be in time to catch him? Yes, answered the new guide. I've timed it all. He'll still be at Calais when we arrive. But when we do catch him at Calais, said the professor, what are we going to do? At this question the countenance of Dr. Bull fell for the first time. He reflected a little and then said, theoretically, I suppose we ought to call the police. Not I, said Syme. Theoretically I ought to drown myself first. I promised a poor fellow, who was a real modern pessimist, on my word of honor not to tell the police. I'm no hand at casuistry, but I can't break my word to a modern pessimist. It's like breaking one's word to a child. I'm in the same boat, said the professor. I tried to tell the police, and I couldn't, because of some silly oath I took. You see, when I was an actor I was a sort of all-round beast. Perjury or treason is the only crime I haven't committed. If I did, that I shouldn't know the difference between right and wrong. I've been through all that, said Dr. Bull, and I've made up my mind. I gave my promise to the secretary. You know him, man, who smiles upside down. My friends, that man is the most utterly unhappy man that was ever human. It may be his digestion, or his conscience, or his nerves, or his philosophy of the universe, but he's damned, he's in hell. Well, I can't turn on a man like that and hunt him down. It's like whipping a leper. I may be mad, but that's how I feel, and there's jolly well the end of it. I don't think you're mad, said Syme. I knew you would decide like that when first you... said Dr. Bull, when first you took off your spectacles. Dr. Bull smiled a little and strolled across the deck to look at the sunlit sea. Then he strolled back again, kicking his heels carelessly, and a companionable silence fell between the three men. Well, said Syme, it seems that we have all the same kind of morality, or immorality, so we had better face the fact that comes of it. Yes, assented the professor, you're quite right, and we must hurry up, for I can see the grey nose standing out from France. The fact that comes of it, said Syme seriously, is this, that we three are alone on this planet. Gogol has gone, God knows where, perhaps. The president has smashed him like a fly. On the council we are three, men against three, like the Romans who held the bridge. But we are worse off than that, first because they can appeal to their organization and we cannot appeal to ours, and second because one of those other three men, said the professor, is not a man. Syme nodded and was silent for a second or two. Then he said, my idea is this. We must do something to keep the Marquis in Calais till tomorrow midday. I have turned over 20 schemes in my head. We cannot denounce him as a dynamiter, that is agreed. We cannot get him detained on some trivial charge, for we should have to appear, he knows us, and he would smell a rat. We cannot pretend to keep him on anarchist business, he may swallow much in that way, but not the notion of stopping in Calais while the Tsar went safely through Paris. We may try to kidnap him and lock him up ourselves, but he is a well-known man here. He has a whole bodyguard of friends. He is very strong and brave, and the event is doubtful. The only thing I can see to do is actually to take advantage of the very things that are in the Marquis's favor. I am going to profit by the fact that he is a highly respected nobleman. I am going to profit by the fact that he has many friends and moves in the best society. What the devil are you talking about? Asked the professor. The Symes are first mentioned in the 14th century, said Syme, but there is a tradition that one of them rode behind Bruce at Bannockburn. Since 1350 the tree is quite clear. He's gone off his head, said the little doctor, staring. Our bearings, continued Syme calmly, are argent as chevron gules, charged with 3 crosslets of the field. The motto varies. The professor seized Syme roughly by the waistcoat. We are just inshore, he said. Are you seasick or joking in the wrong place? My remarks are almost painfully practical, answered Syme, in an unhurried manner. The house of St. Eustache also is very ancient. The Marquis cannot deny that he is a gentleman. He cannot deny that I am a gentleman. And in order to put the matter of my social position quite beyond a doubt, I propose at the earliest opportunity to knock his hat off. But here we are in the harbor. They went on shore under the strong sun in a sort of daze. Syme, who had now taken the lead as Bull had taken it in London, led them along a kind of marine parade until he came to some cafes embowered in a bulk of greenery and overlooking the sea. As he went before them his step was slightly swaggering, and he swung his stick like a sword. He was making, apparently, for the extreme end of the line of cafes, but he stopped abruptly. With a sharp gesture he motioned them to silence, but he pointed with one gloved finger to a cafe table under a bank of flowering foliage at which sat the Marquis de St. Chapter 10. The Duel. Syme sat down at a cafe table with his companions, his blue eyes sparkling like the bright sea below, and ordered a bottle of Sommer with a pleased impatience. He was for some reason in a condition of curious hilarity. His spirits were already unnaturally high. They rose as the Sommer sank, and in half an hour his talk was a torrent of nonsense. He professed to be making out a plan of the conversation which was going to ensue between himself and the deadly Marquis. He jotted it down wildly with a pencil. It was arranged like a printed catechism, with questions and answers, and was delivered with an extraordinary rapidity of utterance. I shall approach. Before taking off his hat, I shall take off my own. I shall say the Marquis de Saint Eustache, I believe. He will say the celebrated Mr. Syme, I presume. He will say in the most exquisite French, "How are you?" I shall reply in the most exquisite Cockney, "Oh, just the Syme." "Oh, shut it," said the man in spectacles. "Pull yourself together and chuck away that bit of paper. What are you really going to do?" "But it was a lovely catechism," said Syme pathetically. "Do let me read it you. It has only 43 questions and answers, and some of the Marquis's answers are wonderfully witty. I like to be just to my enemy, but what's the good of it all?" asked Dr. Bull in exasperation. "It leads up to my challenge, don't you see?" said Syme, beaming. 1. The Marquis has given the 39th reply, which runs, "Has it by any chance occurred to you," asked the professor, with a ponderous simplicity, "that the Marquis may not say all the 43 things you have put down for him? In that case, I understand your own epigrams may appear somewhat more forced." Syme struck the table with a radiant face. "Why, how true that is," he said, "and I never thought of it. Sir, you have an intellect beyond the common. You will make a name." "Oh, you're as drunk as an owl," said the doctor. "It only remains," continued Syme quite unperturbed, "to adopt some other method of breaking the ice, if I may so express it, between myself and the man I wish to kill. And since the course of a dialogue cannot be predicted by one of its parties alone, as you have pointed out with such recondite acumen, the only thing to be done, I suppose, is for the one party, as far as possible, to do all the dialogue by himself. And so I will, by George." And he stood up suddenly, his yellow hair blowing in the slight sea breeze. A band was playing in a cafe chantant hidden somewhere among the trees, and a woman had just stopped singing. On Syme's heated head the bray of the brass band seemed like the jar and jingle of that barrel organ in Leicester Square, to the tune of which he had once stood up to die. He looked across to the little table where the Marquis sat. The man had 2 companions now, solemn Frenchmen in frock coats and silk hats, one of them with the red rosette of the Legion of Honor, evidently people of a solid social position. Besides these black, cylindrical costumes, the Marquis, in his loose straw hat and light spring clothes, looked bohemian and evening barbaric. But he looked the Marquis truly. One may say that he looked the king, with his animal elegance, his scornful eyes, and his proud head lifted against the purple sea. But he was no Christian king, at any rate. He was rather some swarthy despot, half Greek, half Asiatic, who in the days when slavery seemed natural looked down on the Mediterranean, on his galley and his groaning slaves. Just so, Syme thought, would the brown gold face of such a tyrant have shone against the dark green olives and the burning blue. "Are you going to address the meeting?" asked the professor peevishly, seeing that Syme still stood up without moving. Syme drained his last glass of sparkling wine. "I am," he said, pointing across to the Marquis and his companions. That meeting displeases me. I am going to pull that meeting's great ugly mahogany-colored nose." He stepped across swiftly, if not quite steadily. The Marquis, seeing him, arched his black Assyrian eyebrows in surprise, but smiled politely. "You are Mr. Syme, I think," he said. Syme bowed. "And you are the Marquis de Saint Eustache," he said gracefully. "Permit me to pull your nose." He leant over to do so, but the Marquis started backwards, upsetting his chair, and the 2 men in top hats held Syme back by the shoulders. "This man has insulted me," said Syme, with gestures of explanation. "Insulted you?" cried the gentleman with the red rosette. "When?" "Oh, just now," said Syme recklessly. "He'd insulted my mother." "Insulted your mother?" exclaimed the gentleman incredulously. "Well, anyhow," said Syme, conceding a point, "my aunt." "But how can the Marquis have insulted your aunt just now?" said the second gentleman with some legitimate wonder. He has been sitting here all the time. Ah, it was what he said Syme darkly. I said nothing at all, said the Marquis, except something about the band. I only said that I liked Wagner played well. It was an allusion to my family, said Syme firmly. My aunt played Wagner badly. It was a painful subject. We are always being insulted about it. This seems most extraordinary, said the gentleman who was decor, looking doubtfully at the Marquis. Oh, I assure you, said Syme earnestly, the whole of your conversation was simply packed with sinister allusions to my aunt's weaknesses. This is nonsense, said the second gentleman. I for one have said nothing for half an hour except that I liked the singing of that girl with black hair. Well, there you are again, said Syme indignantly. My aunt's was red. It seems to me, said the other, that you are simply seeking a pretext to insult the Marquis. By George, said Syme, facing round and looking at him, what a clever chap you are. The Marquis started up with eyes flaming like a tiger's. Seeking a quarrel with me, he cried, seeking a fight with me. By God, there was never a man who had to seek long. These gentlemen will perhaps act for me. There are still 4 hours of daylight. Let us fight this evening. Syme bowed with a quite beautiful graciousness. Marquis, he said, your action is worthy of your fame and blood. Permit me to consult for a moment with the gentleman in whose hands I shall place myself. In 3 long strides he rejoined his companions, and they, who had seen his champagne-inspired attack and listened to his idiotic explanations, were quite startled at the look of him, for now that he came back to them he was quite sober, a little pale, and he spoke in a low voice of passionate practicality. I have done it, he said hoarsely. I have fixed a fight on the beast. But look here, and listen carefully. There is no time for talk. You are my seconds, and everything must come from you. Now you must insist, and insist absolutely, on the duel coming off after 7 tomorrow, so as to give me the chance of preventing him from catching the 7:45 for Paris. If he misses that, he misses his crime. He can't refuse to meet you on such a small point of time and place. But this is what he will do. He will choose a field somewhere near a wayside station, where he can pick up the train. He is a very good swordsman, and he will trust to killing me in time to catch it. But I can fence well too, and I think I can keep him in play at any rate until the train is lost. Then perhaps he may kill me to console his feelings. You understand? Very well then, let me introduce you to some charming friends of mine. And leading them quickly across the parade, he presented them to the Marquis's seconds by 2 very aristocratic names of which they had not previously heard. Syme was subject to spasms of singular common sense, not otherwise a part of his character. They were, as he said of his impulse about the spectacles, poetic intuitions, and they sometimes rose to the exaltation of prophecy. He had correctly calculated in this case the policy of his opponent. When the Marquis was informed by his seconds that Syme could only fight in the morning, he must fully have realized that an obstacle had suddenly arisen between him and his bomb-throwing business in the capital. Naturally, he could not explain this objection to his friends, so he chose the course which Syme had predicted. He induced his seconds to settle on a small meadow not far from the railway, and he trusted to the fatality of the first engagement. When he came down very coolly to the field of honor, no one could have guessed that he had any anxiety about a journey. His hands were in his pockets, his straw hat on the back of his head, his handsome face brazen in the sun. But it may have struck a stranger as odd that there appeared in his train not only his seconds carrying the sword-case, but 2 of his servants carrying a portmanteau and a luncheon basket. Early as was the hour, the sun soaked everything in warmth, and Syme was vaguely surprised to see so many spring flowers burning gold and silver in the tall grass in which the whole company stood almost knee-deep. With the exception of the Marquis, all the men were in somber and solemn morning dress, with hats like black chimney pots. The little doctor, especially with the addition of his black spectacles, looked like an undertaker in a farce. Syme could not help feeling a comic contrast between this funereal church parade of apparel and the rich and glistening meadow, growing wild flowers everywhere. But, truly, this comic contrast between the yellow blossoms and the black hats was but a symbol of the tragic contrast between the yellow blossoms and the black business. On his right was a little wood. Far away to his left lay the long curve of the railway line, which he was, so to speak, guarding from the Marquis, whose goal and escape it was. In front of him, behind the black group of his opponents, he could see, like a tinted cloud, a small almond bush in flower against the faint line of the sea. The member of the Legion of Honor, whose name it seemed was Colonel Ducroix, approached the professor and doctor Bull with great politeness and suggested that the play should terminate with the first considerable hurt. Dr. Bull, however, having been carefully coached by Syme upon this point of policy, insisted, with great dignity and in very bad French, that it should continue until one of the combatants was disabled. Syme had made up his mind that he could avoid disabling the Marquis and prevent the Marquis from disabling him for at least 20 minutes. In 20 minutes the Paris train would have gone by. To a man of the well-known skill and valor of Monsieur de Saint Eustache, said the professor solemnly, it must be a matter of indifference which method is adopted, and our principal has strong reasons for demanding the longer encounter, reasons the delicacy of which prevent me from being explicit, but for the just and honorable nature of which I can. Peste broke from the Marquis behind, whose face had suddenly darkened. Let us stop talking and begin, and he slashed off the head of a tall flower with his stick. Syme understood his rude impatience and instinctively looked over his shoulder to see whether the train was coming in sight. But there was no smoke on the horizon. Colonel Ducroix knelt down and unlocked the case, taking out a pair of twin swords, which took the sunlight and turned to 2 streaks of white fire. He offered one to the Marquis, who snatched it without ceremony, and another to Syme, who took it, bent it, and poised it with as much delay as was consistent with dignity. Then the colonel took out another pair of blades, and taking one himself, and giving another to Dr. Bull, proceeded to place the men. Both combatants had thrown off their coats and waistcoats and stood, sword in hand. The seconds stood on each side of the line of fight with drawn swords also, but still somber in their dark frock coats and hats. The principals saluted. The colonel said quietly, "Engage," and the 2 blades touched and tingled. When the jar of the joined iron ran up Syme's arm, all the fantastic fears that have been the subject of this story fell from him like dreams from a man waking up in bed. He remembered them clearly and in order as mere delusions of the nerves, how the fear of the professor had been the fear of the tyrannic accidents of nightmare, and how the fear of the doctor had been the fear of the airless vacuum of science. The first was the old fear that any miracle may happen, the second the more hopeless, modern fear that no miracle can ever happen. But he saw that these fears were fancies, for he found himself in the presence of the great fact of the fear of death, with its coarse and pitiless common sense. He felt like a man who had dreamed all night of falling over precipices, and had woke up on the morning when he was to be hanged. For as soon as he had seen the sunlight run down the channel of his foe's foreshortened blade, and as soon as he had felt the 2 tongues of steel touch, vibrating like 2 living things, he knew that his enemy was a terrible fighter, and that probably his last hour had come. He felt a strange and vivid value in all the earth around him, in the grass under his feet. He felt the love of life in all living things. He could almost fancy that he heard the grass growing. He could almost fancy that evening as he stood fresh flowers were springing up and breaking into blossom in the meadow, flowers blood red and burning gold and blue, fulfilling the whole pageant of the spring. And whenever his eyes strayed for a flash from the calm, staring, hypnotic eyes of the Marquis, they saw the little tuft of almond tree against the skyline. He had the feeling that if by some miracle he escaped, he would be ready to sit forever before that almond tree, desiring nothing else in the world. But while earth and sky and everything had the living beauty of a thing lost, the other half of his head was as clear as glass, and he was parrying his enemy's point with a kind of clockwork skill of which he had hardly supposed himself capable. Once his enemy's point ran along his wrist, leaving a slight streak of blood, but it either was not noticed or was tacitly ignored. Every now and then he riposted, and once or twice he could almost fancy that he felt his point go home, but as there was no blood on blade or shirt he supposed he was mistaken. Then came an interruption and a change. At the risk of losing all, the Marquis, interrupting his quiet stare, flashed one glance over his shoulder at the line of railway on his right. Then he turned on Syme a face transfigured to that of a fiend, and began to fight as if with 20 weapons. The attack came so fast and furious that the one shining sword seemed a shower of shining arrows. Syme had no chance to look at the railway, but also he had no need. He could guess the reason of the Marquis's sudden madness of battle. The Paris train was in sight, but the Marquis's morbid energy overreached itself. Twice Syme, parrying, knocked his opponent's point far out of the fighting circle, and the third time his riposte was so rapid that there was no doubt about the hit this time. Syme's sword actually bent under the weight of the Marquis's body, which it had pierced. Syme was as certain that he had stuck his blade into his enemy as a gardener that he has stuck his spade into the ground. Yet the Marquis sprang back from the stroke without a stagger, and Syme stood staring at his own sword point like an idiot. There was no blood on it at all. There was an instant of rigid silence, and then Syme in his turn fell furiously on the other, filled with a flaming curiosity. The Marquis was probably, in a general sense, a better fencer than he, as he had surmised at the beginning, but at the moment the Marquis seemed distraught and at a disadvantage. He fought wildly and evening weakly, and he constantly looked away at the railway line, almost as if he feared the train more than the pointed steel. Syme, on the other hand, fought fiercely but still carefully, in an intellectual fury, eager to solve the riddle of his own bloodless sword. For this purpose he aimed less at the Marquis's body and more at his throat and head. A minute and a half afterwards he felt his point enter the man's neck below the jaw. It came out clean. Half mad, he thrust again, and made what should have been a bloody scar on the Marquis's cheek. But there was no scar. For one moment the heaven of Syme again grew black with supernatural terrors. Surely the man had a charmed life. But this new spiritual dread was a more awful thing than had been the mere spiritual topsy-turvydom symbolized by the paralytic who pursued him. The professor was only a goblin. This man was a devil. Perhaps he was the devil. Anyhow, this was certain, that 3 times had a human sword been driven into him, and made no mark. When Syme had that thought he drew himself up, and all that was good in him sang high up in the air as a high wind sings in the trees. He thought of all the human things in his story, of the Chinese lanterns in Saffron Park, of the girl's red hair in the garden, of the honest, beer-swilling sailors down by the dock, of his loyal companions standing by. Perhaps he had been chosen as a champion of all these fresh and kindly things to cross swords with the enemy of all creation. After all, he said to himself, I am more than a devil. I am a man. I can do the one thing which Satan himself cannot do. I can die. And as the word went through his head, he heard a faint and far-off hoot. which would soon be the roar of the Paris train. He fell to fighting again with a supernatural levity, like a Mohammedan, panting for paradise. As the train came nearer and nearer, he fancied he could see people putting up the floral arches in Paris. He joined in the growing noise and the glory of the great republic whose gate he was guarding against hell. His thoughts rose higher and higher with the rising roar of the train, which ended, as if proudly, in a long and piercing whistle. The train stopped. Suddenly, to the astonishment of everyone, the Marquis sprang back quite out of sword reach, and threw down his sword. The leap was wonderful, and not the less wonderful because Syme had plunged his sword a moment before into the man's thigh. "Stop," said the Marquis in a voice that compelled a momentary obedience. "I want to say something." "What is the matter?" asked Colonel Ducroix, staring. "Has there been foul play?" "There has been foul play somewhere," said Dr. Bull, who was a little pale. "Our principal has wounded the Marquis 4 times at least, and he is none the worse." The Marquis put up his hand with a curious air of ghastly patience. "Please let me speak," he said. "It is rather important. Mr. Syme," he continued, turning to his opponent, "we are fighting today, if I remember right, because you expressed a wish which I thought irrational to pull my nose. Would you oblige me by pulling my nose now, as quickly as possible? I have to catch a train." "I protest that this is most irregular," said Dr. Bull indignantly. "It is certainly somewhat opposed to precedent," said Colonel Ducroix, looking wistfully at his principal. "There is, I think, one case on record, Captain Bellegarde and the Baron Zumpt, in which the weapons were changed in the middle of the encounter at the request of one of the combatants. But one can hardly call one's nose a weapon." "Will you or will you not pull my nose?" said the Marquis in exasperation. Come, Mr. Syme, you wanted to do it. Do it. You can have no conception of how important it is to me. Don't be so selfish. Pull my nose at once, when I ask you." And he bent slightly forward with a fascinating smile. The Paris train, panting and groaning, had grated into a little station behind the neighboring hill. Syme had the feeling he had more than once had in these adventures, the sense that a horrible and sublime wave lifted to heaven was just toppling over. Walking in a world he half understood, he took 2 paces forward and seized the Roman nose of this remarkable nobleman. He pulled it hard, and it came off in his hand. He stood for some seconds with a foolish solemnity, with the pasteboard proboscis still between his fingers, looking at it, while the sun and the clouds and the wooded hills looked down upon this imbecile scene. The Marquis broke the silence in a loud and cheerful voice. "If anyone has any use for my left eyebrow," he said, "he can have it. Colonel Ducroix, do accept my left eyebrow. It's the kind of thing that may come in useful any day." And he gravely tore off one of his swarthy Assyrian brows, bringing about half his brown forehead with it, and politely offered it to the colonel, who stood crimson and speechless with rage. "If I had known," he spluttered, "that I was acting for a poltroon who has himself to fight." "Oh, I know," said the Marquis, recklessly throwing various parts of himself right and left about the field. "You are making a mistake, but it can't be explained just now. I tell you the train has come into the station." "Yes," said Dr. Bull fiercely, "and the train shall go out of the station. It shall go out without you. We know well enough for what devil's work." The mysterious Marquis lifted his hands with a desperate gesture. He was a strange scarecrow standing there in the sun, with half his old face peeled off and half another face glaring and grinning from underneath. "Will you drive me mad?" he cried. "The train." "You shall not go by the train," said Syme firmly, and grasped his sword. The wild figure turned towards Syme, and seemed to be gathering itself for a sublime effort before speaking. "You great fat, blasted, blear-eyed, blundering, thundering, brainless, God-forsaken, doddering, damned fool," he said without taking breath. You great silly, pink-faced, tow-headed turnip. You shall not go by this train, repeated Syme. And why the infernal blazes, roared the other, should I want to go by the train? We know all, said the professor sternly. You are going to Paris to throw a bomb, going to Jericho to throw a Jabberwock, cried the other, tearing his hair, which came off easily. Have you all got softening of the brain, that you don't realize what I am? Did you really think I wanted to catch that train? 20 Paris trains may go by for me. Damn Paris trains. Then what did you care about? Began the professor. What did I care about? I didn't care about catching the train. I cared about whether the train caught me, and now, by God, it has caught me. I regret to inform you, said Syme with restraint, that your remarks convey no impression to my mind. Perhaps if you were to remove the remains of your original forehead and some portion of what was once your chin, your meaning would become clearer. Mental lucidity fulfills itself in many ways. What do you mean by saying that the train has caught you? It may be my literary fancy, but somehow I feel that it ought to mean something. It means everything, said the other, and the end of everything. Sunday has us now in the hollow of his hand. Us, repeated the professor, as if stupefied. What do you mean by us? The police, of course, said the Marquis, and tore off his scalp and half his face. The head which emerged was the blonde, well-brushed, smooth-haired head, which is common in the English constabulary, but the face was terribly pale. I am Inspector Ratcliffe, he said, with a sort of haste that verged on harshness. My name is pretty well known to the police, and I can see well enough that you belong to them. But if there is any doubt about my position, I have a card, and he began to pull a blue card from his pocket. The professor gave a tired gesture. Oh, don't show it us, he said wearily. We've got enough of them to equip a paper chase. The little man named Bull had, like many men who seem to be of a mere vivacious vulgarity, sudden movements of good taste. Here he certainly saved the situation. In the amid of this staggering transformation scene he stepped forward with all the gravity and responsibility of a second and addressed the 2 seconds of the Marquis. Gentlemen, he said, we all owe you a serious apology, but I assure you that you have not been made the victims of such a low joke as you imagine, or truly of anything undignified in a man of honor. You have not wasted your time, you have helped to save the world. We are not buffoons, but very desperate men at war with a vast conspiracy. A secret society of anarchists is hunting us like hares, not such unfortunate madmen as may here or there throw a bomb through starvation or German philosophy, but a rich and powerful and fanatical church, a church of Eastern pessimism, which holds it holy to destroy mankind like vermin. How hard they hunt us you can gather from the fact that we are driven to such disguises as those for which I apologize, and to such pranks as this one by which you suffer. The younger second of the Marquis, a short man with a black mustache, bowed politely and said, of course, I accept the apology, but you will in your turn forgive me if I decline to follow you further into your difficulties, and permit myself to say good morning. The sight of an acquaintance and distinguished fellow townsman coming to pieces in the open air is unusual and, upon the whole, sufficient for one day. Colonel Ducroix, I would in no way influence your actions, but if you feel with me that our present society is a little abnormal, I am now going to walk back to the town. Colonel Ducroix moved mechanically, but then tugged abruptly at his white mustache and broke out, No, by George, I won't. If these gentlemen are really in a mess with a lot of low wreckers like that, I'll see them through it. I have fought for France, and it is hard if I can't fight for civilization. Doctor, Bull took off his hat and waved it, cheering as at a public meeting. Don't make too much noise, said Inspector Ratcliffe. Sunday may hear. You, Sunday, cried Bull, and dropped his hat. Yes, retorted Ratcliffe, he may be with them. With whom? Asked Syme. With the people out of that train, said the other. What you say seems utterly wild, began Syme. Why, as a matter of fact, but, my God, he cried out suddenly, like a man who sees an explosion a long way off. By God, if this is true, the whole bally lot of us on the anarchist council were against anarchy. Every born man was a detective except the president and his personal secretary. What can it mean? Mean, said the new policeman with incredible violence. It means that we are struck dead. Don't you know Sunday? Don't you know that his jokes are always so big and simple that one has never thought of them? Can you think of anything more like Sunday than this, that he should put all his powerful enemies on the Supreme Council, and then take care that it was not supreme? I tell you, he has bought every trust, he has captured every cable, he has control of every railway line, especially of that railway line. And he pointed a shaking finger towards the small wayside station. The whole movement was controlled by him. Half the world was ready to rise for him. But there were just 5 people, perhaps, who would have resisted him, and the old devil put them on the Supreme Council to waste their time in watching each other. Idiots that we are, he planned the whole of our idiocies. Sunday knew that the professor would chase Syme through London, and that Syme would fight me in France. And he was combining great masses of capital and seizing great lines of telegraphy, while we 5 idiots were running after each other like a lot of confounded babies playing blind man's buff. Well, asked Syme with a sort of steadiness. Well, replied the other with sudden serenity, he has found us playing blind man's buff today in a field of great rustic beauty and extreme solitude. He has probably captured the world. It only remains to him to capture this field and all the fools in it. And since you really want to know what was my objection to the arrival of that train, I will tell you. My objection was that Sunday or his secretary has just this moment got out of it. Syme uttered an involuntary cry, and they all turned their eyes towards the far-off station. It was quite true that a considerable bulk of people seemed to be moving in their direction, but they were too distant to be distinguished in any way. It was a habit of the late Marquis de St. Eustache, said the new policeman, producing a leather case, always to carry a pair of opera glasses. Either the president or the secretary is coming after us with that mob. They have caught us in a nice quiet place where we are under no temptations to break our oaths by calling the police. Dr. Bull, I have a suspicion that you will see better through these than through your own highly decorative spectacles. He handed the field glasses to the doctor, who immediately took off his spectacles and put the apparatus to his eyes. It cannot be as bad as you say, said the professor, somewhat shaken. There are a good number of them certainly, but they may easily be ordinary tourists. Do ordinary tourists, asked Bull, with the field glasses to his eyes, wear black masks halfway down the face? Syme almost tore the glasses out of his hand and looked through them. Most men in the advancing mob really looked ordinary enough, but it was quite true that 2 or 3 of the leaders in front wore black half masks almost down to their mouths. This disguise is very complete, especially at such a distance, and Syme found it impossible to conclude anything from the clean-shaven jaws and chins of the men talking in the front. Chapter 11. The criminals chase the police. Syme put the field glasses from his eyes with an almost ghastly relief. The president is not with them, anyhow, he said, and wiped his forehead. But surely they are right away on the horizon, said the bewildered colonel, blinking and but half recovered from Bull's hasty though polite explanation. Could you possibly know your president among all those people? Could I know a white elephant among all those people? Answered Syme, somewhat irritably. As you very truly say, they are on the horizon. But if he were walking with them, by God, I believe this ground would shake. After an instant's pause, the new man called Ratcliffe said with gloomy decision, "Of course the president isn't with them. I wish to Gemini he were. Much more likely the president is riding in triumph through Paris, or sitting on the ruins of St. Paul's Cathedral." "This is absurd," said Syme. "Something may have happened in our absence, but he cannot have carried the world with a rush like that." "It is quite true," he added, frowning dubiously at the distant fields that lay towards the little station. "It is certainly true that there seems to be a crowd coming this way, but they are not all the army that you make out." "Oh, they," said the new detective contemptuously. "No, they are not a very valuable force. But let me tell you frankly that they are precisely calculated to our value. We are not much, my boy, in Sunday's universe. He has got hold of all the cables and telegraphs himself. But to kill the Supreme Council he regards as a trivial matter, like a postcard. It may be left to his private secretary," and he spat on the grass. Then he turned to the others and said somewhat austerely, "There is a great deal to be said for death, but if anyone has any preference for the other alternative, I strongly advise him to walk after me." With these words, he turned his broad back and strode with silent energy towards the wood. The others gave one glance over their shoulders and saw that the dark cloud of men had detached itself from the station and was moving with a mysterious discipline across the plain. They saw, already, evening with the naked eye, black blots on the foremost faces, which marked the masks they wore. They turned and followed their leader, who had already struck the wood and disappeared among the twinkling trees. The sun on the grass was dry and hot, so in plunging into the wood they had a cool shock of shadow as of divers who plunge into a dim pool. The inside of the wood was full of shattered sunlight and shaken shadows. They made a sort of shuddering veil, almost recalling the dizziness of a cinematograph evening. The solid figures walking with him Syme could hardly see for the patterns of sun and shade that danced upon them. Now a man's head was lit as with a light of Rembrandt, leaving all else obliterated. Now again he had strong and staring white hands with the face of a Negro. The ex-marquis had pulled the old straw hat over his eyes, and the black shade of the brim cut his face so squarely in two that it seemed to be wearing one of the black half-masks of their pursuers. The fancy tinted Syme's overwhelming sense of wonder. Was he wearing a mask? Was anyone wearing a mask? Was anyone anything? This wood of witchery, in which men's faces turned black and white by turns, in which their figures first swelled into sunlight and then faded into formless night, this mere chaos of chiaroscuro after the clear daylight outside, seemed to Syme a perfect symbol of the world in which he had been moving for 3 days, this world where men took off their beards and their spectacles and their noses and turned into other people. That tragic self-confidence which he had felt when he believed that the Marquis was a devil had strangely disappeared now that he knew that the Marquis was a friend. He felt almost inclined to ask, after all these bewilderments, what was a friend and what an enemy? Was there anything that was apart from what it seemed? The Marquis had taken off his nose and turned out to be a detective. May he not just as well take off his head and turn out to be a hobgoblin? Was not everything, after all, like this bewildering woodland, this dance of dark and light? Everything only a glimpse, the glimpse always unforeseen and always forgotten. For Gabriel Syme had found in the heart of that sun-splashed wood what many modern painters had found there. He had found the thing which the modern people call impressionism, which is another name for that final skepticism which can find no floor to the universe. As a man in an evil dream strains himself to scream and wake, Syme strove with a sudden effort to fling off this last and worst of his fancies. With 2 impatient strides he overtook the man in the Marquis's straw hat, the man whom he had come to address as Ratcliffe. In a voice exaggeratively loud and cheerful, he broke the bottomless silence and made conversation. "May I ask," he said, "where on earth we are all going to?" So genuine had been the doubts of his soul that he was quite glad to hear his companion speak in an easy, human voice. "We must get down through the town of Lancey to the sea," he said. "I think that part of the country is least likely to be with them." "What can you mean by all this?" cried Syme. "They can't be running the real world in that way. Surely not many working men are anarchists, and surely if they were, mere mobs could not beat modern armies and police." "Mere mobs," repeated his new friend with a snort of scorn. "So you talk about mobs and the working classes as if they were the question. You've got that eternal idiotic idea that if anarchy came it would come from the poor. Why should it? The poor have been rebels, but they have never been anarchists. They have more interest than anyone else in there being some decent government. The poor man really has a stake in the country. The rich man hasn't. He can go away to New Guinea in a yacht. The poor have sometimes objected to being governed badly. The rich have always objected to being governed at all. Aristocrats were always anarchists, as you can see from the Barons' Wars." "As a lecture on English history for the little ones," said Syme. "This is all very nice, but I have not yet grasped its application." "Its application is," said his informant, "that most of old Sunday's right-hand men are South African and American millionaires. That is why he has got hold of all the communications, and that is why the last 4 champions of the anti-anarchist police force are running through a wood like rabbits." "Millionaires I can understand," said Syme thoughtfully. "They are nearly all mad. But getting hold of a few wicked old gentlemen with hobbies is one thing. Getting hold of great Christian nations is another. I would bet the nose off my face, forgive the illusion, that Sunday would stand perfectly helpless before the task of converting any ordinary healthy person anywhere." "Well," said the other, "it rather depends what sort of person you mean." "Well, for instance," said Syme, "he could never convert that person," and he pointed straight in front of him. They had come to an open space of sunlight, which seemed to express to Syme the final return of his own good sense, and in the middle of this forest clearing was a figure that may well stand for that common sense in an almost awful actuality, burnt by the sun and stained with perspiration, and grave with the bottomless gravity of small necessary toils. A heavy French peasant was cutting wood with a hatchet. His cart stood a few yards off, already half full of timber, and the horse that cropped the grass was like his master, valorous but not desperate. Like his master, he was evening prosperous, but yet was almost sad. The man was a Norman, taller than the average of the French and very angular, and his swarthy figure stood dark against a square of sunlight, almost like some allegoric figure of labor frescoed on a ground of gold. "Mr. Syme is saying," called out Ratcliffe to the French colonel, "that this man, at least, will never be an anarchist." "Mr. Syme is right enough there," answered Colonel Duckwa, laughing, "if only for the reason that he has plenty of property to defend. But I forgot that in your country you are not used to peasants being wealthy." "He looks poor," said Dr. Bull doubtfully. "Quite so," said the colonel, "that is why he is rich." "I have an idea," called out Dr. Bull suddenly. "How much would he take to give us a lift in his cart? Those dogs are all on foot, and we could soon leave them behind." "Oh, give him anything," said Syme eagerly. "I have piles of money on me." "That will never do," said the colonel. "He will never have any respect for you unless you drive a bargain." "Oh, if he haggles," began Bull impatiently. "He haggles because he is a free man," said the other. "You do not understand. He would not see the meaning of generosity. He is not being tipped." End evening. while they seemed to hear the heavy feet of their strange pursuers behind them. They had to stand and stamp while the French colonel talked to the French woodcutter with all the leisurely badinage and bickering of market day. At the end of the 4 minutes, however, they saw that the colonel was right, for the woodcutter entered into their plans not with the vague servility of a tout too well paid, but with the seriousness of a solicitor who had been paid the proper fee. He told them that the best thing they could do was to make their way down to the little inn on the hills above Lancy, where the innkeeper, an old soldier who had become devout in his latter years, would be certain to sympathize with them, an evening to take risks in their support. The whole company, therefore, piled themselves on top of the stacks of wood and went rocking in the rude cart down the other and steeper side of the woodland. Heavy and ramshackle as was the vehicle, it was driven quickly enough, and they soon had the exhilarating impression of distancing altogether those, whoever they were, who were hunting them, for, after all, the riddle as to where the anarchists had got all these followers was still unsolved. One man's presence had sufficed for them. They had fled at the first sight of the deformed smile of the secretary. Syme every now and then looked back over his shoulder at the army on their track. As the wood grew first thinner and then smaller with distance, he could see the sunlit slopes beyond it and above it, and across these was still moving the square black mob like one monstrous beetle. In the very strong sunlight, and with his own very strong eyes, which were almost telescopic, Syme could see this mass of men quite plainly. He could see them as separate human figures, but he was increasingly surprised by the way in which they moved as one man. They seemed to be dressed in dark clothes and plain hats, like any common crowd out of the streets, but they did not spread and sprawl and trail by various lines to the attack as would be natural in an ordinary mob. They moved with a sort of dreadful and wicked woodenness, like a staring army of automatons. Syme pointed this out to Ratcliffe. "Yes," replied the policeman, "that's discipline. That's Sunday. He is perhaps 500 miles off, but the fear of him is on all of them, like the finger of God. Yes, they are walking regularly, and you bet your boots that they are talking regularly, yes, and thinking regularly. But the one important thing for us is that they are disappearing regularly." Syme nodded. It was true that the black patch of the pursuing men was growing smaller and smaller as the peasant belabored his horse. The level of the sunlit landscape, though flat as a whole, fell away on the farther side of the wood in billows of heavy slope towards the sea, in a way not unlike the lower slopes of the Sussex Downs. The only difference was that in Sussex the road would have been broken and angular like a little brook, but here the white French road fell sheer in front of them like a waterfall. Down this direct descent the cart clattered at a considerable angle, and in a few minutes, the road growing yet steeper, they saw below them the little harbour of Lancy and a great blue arc of the sea. The travelling cloud of their enemies had wholly disappeared from the horizon. The horse and cart took a sharp turn round a clump of elms, and the horse's nose nearly struck the face of an old gentleman who was sitting on the benches outside the little café of La Solille door. The peasant grunted an apology and got down from his seat. The others also descended one by one and spoke to the old gentleman with fragmentary phrases of courtesy, for it was quite evident from his expansive manner that he was the owner of the little tavern. He was a white-haired, apple-faced old boy, with sleepy eyes and a grey moustache, stout, sedentary, and very innocent, of a type that may often be found in France, but is still commoner in Catholic Germany. Everything about him, his pipe, his pot of beer, his flowers, and his beehive, suggested an ancestral peace. Only when his visitors looked up, as they entered the inn parlour, they saw the sword upon the wall. The colonel, who greeted the innkeeper as an old friend, passed rapidly into the inn parlour and sat down ordering some ritual refreshment. The military decision of his action interested Syme, who sat next to him, and he took the opportunity when the old innkeeper had gone out of, satisfying his curiosity. "May I ask you, Colonel," he said in a low voice, "why we have come here?" Colonel Duckwa smiled behind his bristly white mustache. "For two reasons, sir," he said, "and I will give first, not the most important, but the most utilitarian. We came here because this is the only place within 20 miles in which we can get horses." "Horses?" repeated Syme, looking up quickly. "Yes," replied the other. "If you people are really to distance your enemies, it is horses or nothing for you, unless of course you have bicycles and motor cars in your pocket." "And where do you advise us to make for?" asked Syme doubtfully. "Beyond question," replied the colonel. "You had better make all haste to the police station beyond the town. My friend, whom I seconded under somewhat deceptive circumstances, seems to me to exaggerate very much the possibilities of a general rising. But evening he would hardly maintain, I suppose, that you were not safe with the gendarmes." Syme nodded gravely. Then he said abruptly, "And your other reason for coming here?" "My other reason for coming here," said Duckwa soberly, "is that it is just as well to see a good man or two when one is possibly near to death." Syme looked up at the wall and saw a crudely painted and pathetic religious picture. Then he said, "You are right," and then almost immediately afterwards, "Has anyone seen about the horses?" "Yes," answered Duckwa, "you may be quite certain that I gave orders the moment I came in. Those enemies of yours gave no impression of hurry, but they were really moving wonderfully fast, like a well-trained army. I had no idea that the anarchists had so much discipline. You have not a moment to waste." Almost as he spoke, the old innkeeper with the blue eyes and white hair came ambling into the room and announced that 6 horses were saddled outside. By Duckwa's advice, the 5 others equipped themselves with some portable form of food and wine, and keeping their dueling swords as the only weapons available, they clattered away down the steep, white road. The 2 servants, who had carried the Marquis's luggage when he was a marquis, were left behind to drink at the cafe by common consent and not at all against their own inclination. By this time the afternoon sun was slanting westward, and by its rays, Syme could see the sturdy figure of the old innkeeper growing smaller and smaller, but still standing and looking after them quite silently, the sunshine in his silver hair. Syme had a fixed, superstitious fancy, left in his mind by the chance phrase of the colonel, that this was truly, perhaps, the last honest stranger whom he should ever see upon the earth. He was still looking at this dwindling figure, which stood as a mere grey blot touched with a white flame against the great green wall of the steep down behind him. And as he stared over the top of the down behind the innkeeper, there appeared an army of black-clad and marching men. They seemed to hang above the good man and his house like a black cloud of locusts. Chapter 12. The Earth in Anarchy. Urging the horses to a gallop, without respect to the rather rugged descent of the road, the horsemen soon regained their advantage over the men on the march, and at last the bulk of the first buildings of Lancy cut off the sight of their pursuers. Nevertheless, the ride had been a long one, and by the time they reached the real town the west was warming with the color and quality of sunset. The colonel suggested that, before making finally for the police station, they should make the effort, in passing, to attach to themselves one more individual who may be useful. "For out of the 5 rich men in this town," he said, "are common swindlers. I suppose the proportion is pretty equal all over the world. The 5th is a friend of mine, and a very fine fellow, and what is evening more important from our point of view, he owns a motor car. I am afraid," said the professor in his mirthful way, looking back along the white road on which the black, crawling patch may appear at any moment, "I am afraid we have hardly time for afternoon calls." Dr. Renard's house is only 3 minutes off, said the colonel. Our danger, said Dr. Bull, is not 2 minutes off. Yes, said Syme, if we ride on fast we must leave them behind, for they are on foot. He has a motor car, said the colonel. But we may not get it, said Bull. Yes, he is quite on your side, but he may be out. Hold your tongue, said Syme suddenly. What is that noise? For a second they all sat as still as equestrian statues, and for a second, for 2 or 3 or 4 seconds, heaven and earth seemed equally still. Then all their ears, in an agony of attention, heard, along the road, that indescribable thrill and throb that means only one thing: horses. The colonel's face had an instantaneous change, as if lightning had struck it, and yet left it scatheless. They have done us, he said, with brief military irony. Prepare to receive cavalry. Where can they have got the horses? Asked Syme, as he mechanically urged his steed to a canter. The colonel was silent for a little, then he said in a strained voice, I was speaking with strict accuracy when I said that the Solil door was the only place where one can get horses within 20 miles. No, said Syme violently, I don't believe he'd do it. Not with all that white hair. He may have been forced, said the colonel gently. They must be at least 100 strong, for which reason we are all going to see my friend Renard, who has a motor car. With these words he swung his horse suddenly round a street corner, and went down the street with such thundering speed that the others, though already well at the gallop, had difficulty in following the flying tail of his horse. Dr. Renard inhabited a high and comfortable house at the top of a steep street, so that when the riders alighted at his door they could once more see the solid green ridge of the hill, with the white road across it, standing up above all the roofs of the town. They breathed again to see that the road as yet was clear, and they rang the bell. Dr. Renard was a beaming, brown-bearded man, a good example of that silent but very busy professional class which France has preserved evening more perfectly than England. When the matter was explained to him he pooh-poohed the panic of the ex-marquis altogether. He said, with the solid French skepticism, that there was no conceivable probability of a general anarchist rising. Anarchy, he said, shrugging his shoulders, it is childishness. Et ca, cried out the colonel suddenly, pointing over the other's shoulder, and that is childishness, isn't it? They all looked round and saw a curve of black cavalry come sweeping over the top of the hill with all the energy of Attila. Swiftly as they rode, however, the whole rank still kept well together, and they could see the black vizards of the first line as level as a line of uniforms. But although the main black square was the same, though traveling faster, there was now one sensational difference which they could see clearly upon the slope of the hill, as if upon a slanted map. The bulk of the riders were in one block, but one rider flew far ahead of the column, and with frantic movements of hand and heel urged his horse faster and faster, so that one may have fancied that he was not the pursuer but the pursued. But evening at that great distance they could see something so fanatical, so unquestionable in his figure, that they knew it was the secretary himself. I am sorry to cut short a cultured discussion, said the colonel, but can you lend me your motor car now, in 2 minutes? I have a suspicion that you are all mad, said Dr. Renard, smiling sociably, but God forbid that madness should in any way interrupt friendship. Let us go round to the garage. Dr. Renard was a mild man with monstrous wealth. His rooms were like the Musée de Cluny, and he had 3 motor cars. These, however, he seemed to use very sparingly, having the simple tastes of the French middle class, and when his impatient friends came to examine them, it took them some time to assure themselves that one of them evening could be made to work. This with some difficulty they brought round into the street before the doctor's house. When they came out of the dim garage, they were startled to find that twilight had already fallen with the abruptness of night in the tropics. Either they had been longer in the place than they imagined, or some unusual canopy of cloud had gathered over the town. They looked down the steep streets and seemed to see a slight mist coming up from the sea. "It is now or never," said Dr. Ball. "I hear horses." "No," corrected the professor, "a horse." And as they listened, it was evident that the noise rapidly coming nearer on the rattling stones was not the noise of the whole cavalcade, but that of the one horseman who had left it far behind. The insane secretary. Syme's family, like most of those who end in the simple life, had once owned a motor, and he knew all about them. He had leapt at once into the chauffeur's seat, and with flushed face was wrenching and tugging at the disused machinery. He bent his strength upon one handle, and then said, quite quietly, "I am afraid it's no go." As he spoke, there swept round the corner a man rigid on his rushing horse, with the rush and rigidity of an arrow. He had a smile that thrust out his chin as if it were dislocated. He swept alongside of the stationary car, into which its company had crowded, and laid his hand on the front. It was the secretary, and his mouth went quite straight in the solemnity of triumph. Syme was leaning hard upon the steering wheel, and there was no sound but the rumble of the other pursuers riding into the town. Then there came quite suddenly a scream of scraping iron, and the car leapt forward. It plucked the secretary clean out of his saddle, as a knife is whipped out of its sheath, trailed him kicking terribly for 20 yards, and left him flung flat upon the road far in front of his frightened horse. As the car took the corner of the street with a splendid curve, they could just see the other anarchists filling the street and raising their fallen leader. "I can't understand why it has grown so dark," said the professor at last in a low voice. "Going to be a storm, I think," said Dr. Ball. "I say, it's a pity we haven't got a light on this car, if only to see by." "We have," said the colonel, and from the floor of the car he fished up a heavy, old-fashioned, carved iron lantern with a light inside it. It was obviously an antique, and it would seem as if its original use had been in some way semi-religious, for there was a rude molding of a cross upon one of its sides. "Where on earth did you get that?" asked the professor. "I got it where I got the car," answered the colonel, chuckling, "from my best friend. While our friend here was fighting with the steering wheel, I ran up the front steps of the house and spoke to Renard, who was standing in his own porch, you will remember. 'I suppose,' I said, 'there's no time to get a lamp.' He looked up, blinking amiably at the beautiful arched ceiling of his own front hall. From this was suspended, by chains of exquisite ironwork, this lantern, one of the 100 treasures of his treasure house. By sheer force he tore the lamp out of his own ceiling, shattering the painted panels and bringing down 2 blue vases with his violence. Then he handed me the iron lantern, and I put it in the car. Was I not right when I said that Dr. Renard was worth knowing?" "You were," said Syme seriously, and hung the heavy lantern over the front. There was a certain allegory of their whole position in the contrast between the modern automobile and its strange ecclesiastical lamp. Hitherto they had passed through the quietest part of the town, meeting at most 1 or 2 pedestrians who could give them no hint of the peace or the hostility of the place. Now, however, the windows in the houses began one by one to be lit up, giving a greater sense of habitation and humanity. Dr. Bull turned to the new detective, who had led their flight, and permitted himself one of his natural and friendly smiles. "These lights make one feel more cheerful." Inspector Ratcliffe drew his brows together. "There is only one set of lights that make me more cheerful," he said, "and they are those lights of the police station which I can see beyond the town. Please God we may be there in 10 minutes. Then all Bull's boiling good sense and optimism broke suddenly out of him. "Oh, this is all raving nonsense," he cried. "If you really think that, Ordinary people in ordinary houses are anarchists. You must be madder than an anarchist yourself. If we turned and fought these fellows, the whole town would fight for us. No, said the other with an immovable simplicity, the whole town would fight for them. We shall see. While they were speaking, the professor had leant forward with sudden excitement. What is that noise? He said. Oh, the horses behind us, I suppose, said the colonel. I thought we had got clear of them. The horses behind us. No, said the professor, it is not horses, and it is not behind us. Almost as he spoke, across the end of the street before them two shining and rattling shapes shot past. They were gone almost in a flash, but everyone could see that they were motor cars, and the professor stood up with a pale face and swore that they were the other two motor cars from Dr. Renard's garage. I tell you they were his, he repeated, with wild eyes, and they were full of men in masks. Absurd, said the colonel angrily. Dr. Renard would never give them his cars. He may have been forced, said Ratcliffe quietly. The whole town is on their side. You still believe that? Asked the colonel incredulously. You will all believe it soon, said the other with a hopeless calm. There was a puzzled pause for some little time, and then the colonel began again abruptly. No, I can't believe it. The thing is nonsense. The plain people of a peaceable French town. He was cut short by a bang and a blaze of light, which seemed close to his eyes. As the car sped on, it left a floating patch of white smoke behind it, and Syme had heard a shot shriek past his ear. My God, said the colonel, someone has shot at us. It need not interrupt conversation, said the gloomy Ratcliffe. Pray, resume your remarks, Colonel. You were talking, I think, about the plain people of a peaceable French town. The staring colonel was long past minding satire. He rolled his eyes all round the street. It is extraordinary, he said, most extraordinary. A fastidious person, said Syme, may evening call it unpleasant. However, I suppose those lights out in the field beyond this street are the gendarmerie. We shall soon get there. No, said Inspector Ratcliffe, we shall never get there. He had been standing up and looking keenly ahead of him. Now he sat down and smoothed his sleek hair with a weary gesture. What do you mean? Asked Bull sharply. I mean that we shall never get there, said the pessimist placidly. They have 2 rows of armed men across the road already. I can see them from here. The town is in arms, as I said it was. I can only wallow in the exquisite comfort of my own exactitude. And Ratcliffe sat down comfortably in the car and lit a cigarette. But the others rose excitedly and stared down the road. Syme had slowed down the car as their plans became doubtful, and he brought it finally to a standstill just at the corner of a side street that ran down very steeply to the sea. The town was mostly in shadow, but the sun had not sunk. Wherever its level light could break through, it painted everything a burning gold. Up this side street the last sunset light shone as sharp and narrow as the shaft of artificial light at the theater. It struck the car of the 5 friends and lit it like a burning chariot. But the rest of the street, especially the 2 ends of it, was in the deepest twilight, and for some seconds they could see nothing. Then Syme, whose eyes were the keenest, broke into a little bitter whistle and said, It is quite true. There is a crowd or an army or some such thing across the end of that street. Well, if there is, said Bull impatiently, it must be something else, a sham fight or the mayor's birthday or something. I cannot and will not believe that plain, jolly people in a place like this walk about with dynamite in their pockets. Get on a bit, Syme, and let us look at them. The car crawled about 100 yards farther, and then they were all startled by Dr. Bull breaking into a high crow of laughter. Why, you silly mugs, he cried, what did I tell you? That crowd's as law-abiding as a cow, and if it weren't, it's on our side. How do you know? Asked the professor, staring. You blind bat, cried Bull, don't you see who is leading them? They peered again, and then the colonel, with a catch in his voice, cried out, why, it's Renard. There was, truly, a rank of dim figures running across the road, and they could not be clearly seen, but far enough in front to catch the accident of the evening light was stalking up and down the unmistakable Dr. Renard in a white hat, stroking his long brown beard and holding a revolver in his left hand. What a fool I've been! Exclaimed the colonel. Of course, the dear old boy has turned out to help us. Doctor, Bull was bubbling over with laughter, swinging the sword in his hand as carelessly as a cane. He jumped out of the car and ran across the intervening space, calling out, Doctor Renard, Doctor Renard. An instant after, Syme thought his own eyes had gone mad in his head, for the philanthropic Doctor Renard had deliberately raised his revolver and fired twice at Bull so that the shots rang down the road, almost at the same second as the puff of white cloud went up from this atrocious explosion. A long puff of white cloud went up also from the cigarette of the cynical Ratcliffe. Like all the rest, he turned a little pale, but he smiled. Dr. Bull, at whom the bullets had been fired, just missing his scalp, stood quite still in the middle of the road without a sign of fear, and then turned very slowly and crawled back to the car and climbed in with 2 holes through his hat. Well, said the cigarette smoker slowly, what do you think now? I think, said Dr. Bull with precision, that I am lying in bed at no 217 Peabody Buildings, and that I shall soon wake up with a jump, or, if that's not it, I think that I am sitting in a small cushioned cell in Hanwell, and that the doctor can't make much of my case. But if you want to know what I don't think, I'll tell you. I don't think what you think. I don't think, and I never shall think, that the mass of ordinary men are a pack of dirty modern thinkers. No, sir, I'm a Democrat, and I still don't believe that Sunday could convert one average navvy or counter jumper. No, I may be mad, but humanity isn't. Syme turned his bright blue eyes on Bull with an earnestness which he did not commonly make clear. You are a very fine fellow, he said. You can believe in a sanity which is not merely your sanity, and you're right enough about humanity, about peasants and people like that jolly old innkeeper. But you're not right about Renard. I suspected him from the first. He's rationalistic, and what's worse, he's rich. When duty and religion are really destroyed, it will be by the rich. They are really destroyed now, said the man with a cigarette, and rose, with his hands in his pockets. The devils are coming on. The men in the motor car looked anxiously in the direction of his dreamy gaze, and they saw that the whole regiment at the end of the road was advancing upon them. Dr. Renard marching furiously in front, his beard flying in the breeze. The colonel sprang out of the car with an intolerant exclamation. Gentlemen, he cried, the thing is incredible. It must be a practical joke. If you knew Renard as I do, it's like calling Queen Victoria a dynamiter. If you had got the man's character into your head, Dr. Bull, said Syme sardonically, has at least got it into his hat. I tell you it can't be, cried the colonel, stamping. Renard shall explain it. He shall explain it to me. And he strode forward. Don't be in such a hurry, drawled the smoker. He will very soon explain it to all of us. But the impatient colonel was already out of earshot, advancing towards the advancing enemy. The excited doctor Renard lifted his pistol again, but, perceiving his opponent, hesitated, and the colonel came face to face with him with frantic gestures of remonstrance. It is no good, said Syme. He will never get anything out of that old heathen. I vote we drive bang through the thick of them, bang as the bullets went through Bull's hat. We may all be killed, but we must kill a tidy number of them. I won't ave it, said Dr. Bull, growing more vulgar in the sincerity of his virtue. The poor chaps may be making a mistake. Give the colonel a chance. Shall we go back, then? Asked the professor. No, said Ratcliffe in a cold voice, the street behind us is held too. In fact, I seem to see there another friend of yours, Syme. Syme spun round smartly and stared backwards at the track which they had travelled. He saw an irregular body of horsemen gathering and galloping towards them in the gloom. He saw above the foremost saddle the silver gleam of a sword, and then, as it grew nearer, the silver gleam of an old man's hair. The next moment, with shattering violence, he had swung the motor round and sent it dashing down the steep side street to the sea, like a man that desired only to die. What the devil is up? Cried the professor, seizing his arm. The morning star has fallen, said Syme, as his own car went down the darkness like a falling star. The others did not understand his words, but when they looked back at the street above they saw the hostile cavalry coming round the corner, and down the slopes after them, and foremost of all rode the good innkeeper, flushed with the fiery innocence of the evening light. The world is insane, said the professor, and buried his face in his hands. No, said Dr. Bull in adamantine humility, it is I. What are we going to do? Asked the professor. At this moment, said Syme, with a scientific detachment, I think we are going to smash into a lamppost. The next instant the automobile had come with a catastrophic jar against an iron object. The instant after that 4 men had crawled out from under a chaos of metal, and a tall lean lamp post that had stood up straight on the edge of the marine parade stood out, bent and twisted, like the branch of a broken tree. Well, we smashed something, said the professor, with a faint smile. That's some comfort. You're becoming an anarchist, said Syme, dusting his clothes with his instinct of daintiness. Everyone is, said Ratcliffe. As they spoke, the white-haired horseman and his followers came thundering from above, and almost at the same moment a dark string of men ran shouting along the sea-front. Syme snatched a sword and took it in his tests. He stuck 2 others under his armpits, took a fourth in his left hand and the lantern in his right, and leapt off the high parade onto the beach below. The others leapt after him, with a common acceptance of such decisive action, leaving the debris and the gathering mob above them. We have one more chance, said Syme, taking the steel out of his mouth. Whatever all this pandemonium means, I suppose the police station will help us. We can't get there, for they hold the way. But there's a pier, or breakwater runs out into the sea just here, which we could defend, longer than anything else, like Horatius and his bridge. We must defend it till the gendarmerie turn out. Keep after me. They followed him as he went crunching down the beach, and in a second or 2 their boots broke not on the sea gravel, but on broad, flat stones. They marched down a long, low jetty, running out in one arm into the dim, boiling sea, and when they came to the end of it they felt that they had come to the end of their story. They turned and faced the town. That town was transfigured with uproar. All along the high parade from which they had just descended was a dark and roaring stream of humanity, with tossing arms and fiery faces, groping and glaring towards them. The long dark line was dotted with torches and lanterns, but evening where no flame lit up a furious face they could see in the farthest figure, in the most shadowy gesture, an organized hate. It was clear that they were the accursed of all men, and they knew not why. 2 or 3 men, looking little and black like monkeys, leapt over the edge as they had done and dropped onto the beach. These came plowing down the deep sand, shouting horribly, and strove to wade into the sea at random. The example was followed, and the whole black mass of men began to run and drip over the edge like black treacle. Foremost among the men on the beach Syme saw the peasant who had driven their cart. He splashed into the surf on a huge cart horse and shook his axe at them. The peasant, cried Syme. They have not risen since the Middle Ages. Evening if the police do come now, said the professor mournfully. They can do nothing with this mob. Nonsense, said Bull desperately. There must be some people left in the town who are human. No, said the hopeless inspector, the human being will soon be extinct. We are the last of mankind. It may be, said the professor absently. Then he added in his dreamy voice, what is all that at the end of the dungeon? Nor public flame, nor private, dares to shine, nor human light is left, nor glimpse divine. Lo, your dread empire, chaos, is restored. Light dies before yours uncreating word. Your hand, great anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all. Stop, cried Bull suddenly, the gendarmes are out. The low lights of the police station were truly blotted and broken with hurrying figures, and they heard through the darkness the clash and jingle of a disciplined cavalry. They are charging the mob, cried Bull in ecstasy or alarm. No, said Syme, they are formed along the parade. They have unslung their carbines, cried Bull dancing with excitement. Yes, said Ratcliffe, and they are going to fire on us. As he spoke there came a long crackle of musketry, and bullets seemed to pop like hailstones on the stones in front of them. The gendarmes have joined them, cried the professor, and struck his forehead. I am in the padded cell, said Bull solidly. There was a long silence, and then Ratcliffe said, looking out over the swollen sea, all sort of grey-purple, what does it matter who is mad or who is sane? We shall all be dead soon. Syme turned to him and said, you are quite hopeless, then? Mr. Ratcliffe kept a stony silence. Then at last he said quietly, no, oddly enough I am not quite hopeless. There is one insane little hope that I cannot get out of my mind. The power of this whole planet is against us, yet I cannot help wondering whether this one silly little hope is hopeless yet. In what or whom is your hope? Asked Syme with curiosity. In a man I never saw, said the other, looking at the leaden sea. I know what you mean, said Syme in a low voice. The man in the dark room. But Sunday must have killed him by now. Perhaps, said the other steadily. But if so, he was the only man whom Sunday found it hard to kill. I heard what you said the professor, with his back turned. I, also am holding hard onto the thing I never saw. All of a sudden Syme, who was standing as if blind with introspective thought, swung round and cried out, like a man waking from sleep, where is the colonel? I thought he was with us. The colonel, yes, cried Bull, where on earth is the colonel? He went to speak to Renard, said the professor. We cannot leave him among all those beasts, cried Syme. Let us die, like gentlemen if. Do not pity the colonel, said Ratcliffe, with a pale sneer. He is extremely comfortable. He is. No, 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 cried Syme in a kind of frenzy. Not the colonel, too. I will never believe it. Will you believe your eyes? Asked the other and pointed to the beach. Many of their pursuers had waded into the water shaking their fists, but the sea was rough, and they could not reach the pier. 2 or 3 figures, however, stood on the beginning of the stone footway and seemed to be cautiously advancing down it. The glare of a chance lantern lit up the faces of the 2 foremost. One face wore a black half-mask, and under it the mouth was twisting about in such a madness of nerves that the black tuft of beard wriggled round and round like a restless, living thing. The other was the red face and white moustache of Colonel Ducroix. They were in earnest consultation. Yes, he is gone too, said the professor, and sat down on a stone. Everything's gone. I'm gone. I can't trust my own bodily machinery. I feel as if my own hand may fly up and strike me. When my hand flies up, said Syme, it will strike somebody else, and he strode along the pier towards the colonel, the sword in one hand and the lantern in the other. As if to destroy the last hope or doubt, the colonel, who saw him coming, pointed his revolver at him and fired. The shot missed Syme. but struck his sword, breaking it short at the hilt. Syme rushed on, and swung the iron lantern above his head. Judas before Herod, he said, and struck the colonel down upon the stones. Then he turned to the secretary, whose frightful mouth was almost foaming now, and held the lamp high with so rigid and arresting a gesture that the man was as it were frozen for a moment and forced to hear. "Do you see this lantern?" cried Syme in a terrible voice. "Do you see the cross carved on it, and the flame inside? You did not make it. You did not light it. Better men than you, men who could believe and obey, twisted the entrails of iron and preserved the legend of fire. There is not a street you walk on, there is not a thread you wear, that was not made as this lantern was by denying your philosophy of dirt and rats. You can make nothing, you can only destroy. You will destroy mankind. You will destroy the world. Let that suffice you. Yet this one old Christian lantern you shall not destroy. It shall go where your empire of apes will never have the wit to find it." He struck the secretary once with the lantern so that he staggered, and then, whirling it twice round his head, sent it flying far out to sea, where it flared like a roaring rocket and fell. "Swords!" shouted Syme, turning his flaming face to the three behind him. "Let us charge these dogs, for our time has come to die." His three companions came after him sword in hand. Syme's sword was broken, but he rent a bludgeon from the fist of a fisherman, flinging him down. In a moment they would have flung themselves upon the face of the mob and perished, when an interruption came. The secretary, ever since Syme's speech, had stood with his hand to his stricken head as if dazed. Now he suddenly pulled off his black mask. The pale face thus peeled in the lamplight revealed not so much rage as astonishment. He put up his hand with an anxious authority. "There is some mistake," he said. "Mr. Syme, I hardly think you understand your position. I arrest you in the name of the law." "Of the law?" said Syme, and dropped his stick. "Certainly," said the secretary. "I am a detective from Scotland Yard," and he took a small blue card from his pocket. "And what do you suppose we are?" asked the professor, and threw up his arms. "You," said the secretary stiffly, "are, as I know for a fact, members of the Supreme Anarchist Council, disguised as one of you. I, Dr. Bull tossed his sword into the sea. "There never was any Supreme Anarchist Council," he said. "We were all a lot of silly policemen looking at each other. And all these nice people who have been peppering us with shot thought we were the dynamiters. I knew I couldn't be wrong about the mob," he said, beaming over the enormous multitude, which stretched away to the distance on both sides. "Vulgar people are never mad. I'm vulgar myself, and I know." Chapter 13. The Pursuit of the President. Next morning 5 bewildered but hilarious people took the boat for Dover. The poor old colonel may have had some cause to complain, having been first forced to fight for 2 factions that didn't exist, and then knocked down with an iron lantern. But he was a magnanimous old gentleman, and being much relieved that neither party had anything to do with dynamite, he saw them off on the pier with great geniality. The 5 reconciled detectives had 100 details to explain to each other. The secretary had to tell Syme how they had come to wear masks originally in order to approach the supposed enemy as fellow conspirators. Syme had to explain how they had fled with such swiftness through a civilized country. But above all these matters of detail, which could be explained, rose the central mountain of the matter that they could not explain. What did it all mean? If they were all harmless officers, what was Sunday? If he had not seized the world, what on earth had he been up to? Inspector Ratcliffe was still gloomy about this. "I can't make head or tail of old Sunday's little game any more than you can," he said. "But whatever else Sunday is, he isn't a blameless citizen. Damn it, do you remember his face?" "I grant you," answered Syme, "that I have never been able to forget it. Well, said the secretary, I suppose we can find out soon, for tomorrow we have our next general meeting. You will excuse me, he said, with a rather ghastly smile, for being well acquainted with my secretarial duties. I suppose you are right, said the professor reflectively. I suppose we may find it out from him, but I confess that I should feel a bit afraid of asking Sunday who he really is. Why? Asked the secretary, for fear of bombs. No, said the professor, for fear he may tell me. Let us have some drinks, said Dr. Bull, after a silence. Throughout their whole journey by boat and train they were highly convivial, but they instinctively kept together. Dr. Bull, who had always been the optimist of the party, endeavored to persuade the other four that the whole company could take the same hansom cab from Victoria, but this was overruled, and they went in a four-wheeler, with Dr. Bull on the box, singing. They finished their journey at an hotel in Piccadilly Circus, so as to be close to the early breakfast next morning in Leicester Square. Yet evening then the adventures of the day were not entirely over. Dr. Bull, discontented with the general proposal to go to bed, had strolled out of the hotel at about 11 to see and taste some of the beauties of London. 20 minutes afterwards, however, he came back and made quite a clamor in the hall. Syme, who tried at first to soothe him, was forced at last to listen to his communication with quite new attention. I tell you I've seen him, said Dr. Bull, with thick emphasis. Whom? Asked Syme quickly. Not the president? Not so bad as that, said Dr. Bull, with unnecessary laughter. Not so bad as that. I've got him here. Got whom here? Asked Syme impatiently. Harry, man, said the other lucidly. Man that used to be Harry. Man, Gogol. Here he is, and he pulled forward by a reluctant elbow the identical young man who 5 days before had marched out of the council, with thin red hair and a pale face, the first of all the sham anarchists who had been exposed. Why do you worry with me? He cried. You have expelled me as a spy. We are all spies, whispered Syme. We're all spies, shouted Dr. Bull. Come and have a drink. Next morning the battalion of the reunited six marched stolidly towards the hotel in Leicester Square. This is more cheerful, said Dr. Bull. We are 6 men going to ask one man what he means. I think it is a bit queerer than that, said Syme. I think it is 6 men going to ask one man what they mean. They turned in silence into the square, and though the hotel was in the opposite corner, they saw at once the little balcony and a figure that looked too big for it. He was sitting alone with bent head, poring over a newspaper, but all his councillors, who had come to vote him down, crossed that square as if they were watched out of heaven by 100 eyes. They had disputed much upon their policy about whether they should leave the unmasked Gogol without and begin diplomatically, or whether they should bring him in and blow up the gunpowder at once. The influence of Syme and Bull prevailed for the latter course, though the secretary to the last asked them why they attacked Sunday so rashly. My reason is quite simple, said Syme. I attack him rashly because I am afraid of him. They followed Syme up the dark stair in silence, and they all came out simultaneously into the broad sunlight of the morning, and the broad sunlight of Sunday's smile. Delightful, he said. So pleased to see you all. What an exquisite day it is. Is the Tsar dead? The secretary, who happened to be foremost, drew himself together for a dignified outburst. No, sir, he said sternly, there has been no massacre. I bring you news of no such disgusting spectacles. Disgusting spectacles, repeated the president with a bright, inquiring smile. You mean Dr. Bull's spectacles? The secretary choked for a moment, and the president went on with a sort of smooth appeal. Of course, we all have our opinions and evening our eyes, but really to call them disgusting before the man himself. Dr. Bull tore off his spectacles and broke them on the table. My spectacles are blackguardly, he said, but I'm not. Look at my face. I dare say it's the sort of face that grows on one, said the president. In fact, it grows on you, and who am I to quarrel with the wild fruits upon the tree of life? I dare say it will grow on me some day. We have no time for tomfoolery, said the secretary, breaking in savagely. We have come to know what all this means. Who are you? What are you? Why did you get us all here? Do you know who and what we are? Are you a half-witted man playing the conspirator, or are you a clever man playing the fool? Answer me, I tell you. Candidates, murmured Sunday, are only required to answer 8 out of the 17 questions on the paper. As far as I can make out, you want me to tell you what I am, and what you are, and what this table is, and what this council is, and what this world is for all I know. Well, I will go so far as to rend the veil of one mystery. If you want to know what you are a set of highly well-intentioned young jackasses. And you, said Syme, leaning forward, what are you? What am I? Roared the president, and he rose slowly to an incredible height, like some enormous wave about to arch above them and break. You want to know what I am, do you? Bull, you are a man of science. Grub in the roots of those trees and find out the truth about them. Syme, you are a poet. Stare at those morning clouds. But I tell you this, that you will have found out the truth of the last tree and the topmost cloud before the truth about me. You will understand the sea, and I shall be still a riddle. You shall know what the stars are, and not know what I am. Since the beginning of the world all men have hunted me like a wolf, kings and sages and poets and lawgivers, all the churches and all the philosophies. But I have never been caught yet, and the skies will fall in the time I turn to bay. I have given them a good run for their money, and I will now, before one of them could move. The monstrous man had swung himself like some huge orangutan over the balustrade of the balcony. Yet before he dropped he pulled himself up again as on a horizontal bar, and thrusting his great chin over the edge of the balcony, said solemnly, "There's one thing I'll tell you though about who I am. I am the man in the dark room who made you all policemen." With that he fell from the balcony, bouncing on the stones below like a great ball of india rubber, and went bounding off towards the corner of the Alhambra, where he hailed a hansom cab and sprang inside it. The 6 detectives had been standing thunderstruck and livid in the light of his last assertion, but when he disappeared into the cab, Syme's practical senses returned to him, and leaping over the balcony so recklessly as almost to break his legs, he called another cab. He and Bull sprang into the cab together, the professor and the inspector into another, while the secretary and the late Gogol scrambled into a third just in time to pursue the flying Syme, who was pursuing the flying president. Sunday led them a wild chase towards the northwest, his cabman, evidently under the influence of more than common inducements, urging the horse at breakneck speed. But Syme was in no mood for delicacies, and he stood up in his own cab shouting, "Stop, thief!" until crowds ran along beside his cab, and policemen began to stop and ask questions. All this had its influence upon the president's cabman, who began to look dubious and to slow down to a trot. He opened the trap to talk reasonably to his fare, and in so doing let the long whip droop over the front of the cab. Sunday leant forward, seized it, and jerked it violently out of the man's hand. Then, standing up in front of the cab himself, he lashed the horse and roared aloud, so that they went down the streets like a flying storm. Through street after street, and square after square went whirling this preposterous vehicle, in which the fare was urging the horse and the driver trying desperately to stop it. The other 3 cabs came after it, if the phrase be permissible of a cab, like panting hounds. Shops and streets shot by like rattling arrows. At the highest ecstasy of speed, Sunday turned round on the splashboard where he stood, and sticking his great grinning head out of the cab, with white hair whistling in the wind. He made a horrible face at his pursuers, like some colossal urchin. Then, raising his right hand swiftly, he flung a ball of paper in Syme's face and vanished. Syme caught the thing while instinctively warding it off and discovered that it consisted of two crumpled papers. One was addressed to himself and the other to Dr. Bull, with a very long, and it is to be feared partly ironical, string of letters after his name. Dr. Bull's address was at any rate considerably longer than his communication, for the communication consisted entirely of the words, "What about Martin Tupper now? What does the old maniac mean?" asked Bull, staring at the words. "What does yours say, Syme?" Syme's message was, at any rate, longer, and ran as follows. "No one would regret anything in the nature of an interference by the Archdeacon more than I. I trust it will not come to that. But for the last time, where are your goloshes? The thing is too bad, especially after what Uncle said." The president's cabman seemed to be regaining some control over his horse, and the pursuers gained a little as they swept round into the Edgware Road. And here there occurred what seemed to the Allies a providential stoppage. Traffic of every kind was swerving to right or left or stopping, for down the long road was coming the unmistakable roar announcing the fire engine, which in a few seconds went by like a brazen thunderbolt. But quick as it went by, Sunday had bounded out of his cab, sprung at the fire engine, caught it, slung himself onto it, and was seen as he disappeared in the noisy distance talking to the astonished fireman with explanatory gestures. "After him," howled Syme. "He can't go astray now. There's no mistaking a fire engine." The three cabmen, who had been stunned for a moment, whipped up their horses and slightly decreased the distance between themselves and their disappearing prey. The president acknowledged this proximity by coming to the back of the car, bowing repeatedly, kissing his hand, and finally flinging a neatly folded note into the bosom of Inspector Ratcliffe. When that gentleman opened it, not without impatience, he found it contained the words, "Fly at once. The truth about your trouser stretchers is known." A friend, the fire engine had struck still farther to the north, into a region that they did not recognize, and as it ran by a line of high railings, shadowed with trees, the six friends were startled, but somewhat relieved to see the president leap from the fire engine, though whether through another whim or the increasing protest of his entertainers they could not see. Before the three cabs, however, could reach up to the spot, he had gone up the high railings like a huge gray cat, tossed himself over, and vanished in a darkness of leaves. Syme, with a furious gesture, stopped his cab, jumped out, and sprang also to the escalade. When he had one leg over the fence, and his friends were following, he turned a face on them, which shone quite pale in the shadow. "What place can this be?" he asked. "Can it be the old devil's house? I've heard he has a house in North London." "All the better," said the secretary grimly, planting a foot in a foothold. "We shall find him at home." "No, but it isn't that," said Syme, knitting his brows. "I hear the most horrible noises, like devils laughing and sneezing and blowing their devilish noses." "His dog's barking, of course," said the secretary. "Why not say his black beetle's barking?" said Syme furiously. "Snails barking, geraniums barking. Did you ever hear a dog bark like that?" He held up his hand, and there came out of the thicket a long growling roar that seemed to get under the skin and freeze the flesh, a low, thrilling roar that made a throbbing in the air all about them. "The dogs of Sunday would be no ordinary dogs," said Gogol, and shuddered. Syme had jumped down on the other side, but he still stood listening, impatiently. "Well, listen to that," he said. "Is that a dog? Anybody's dog?" There broke upon their ear a hoarse screaming as of things protesting and clamoring in sudden pain, and then, far off like an echo, what sounded like a long nasal trumpet. "Well, his house ought to be hell," said the secretary, "and if it is hell, I'm going in." and he sprang over the tall railings almost with one swing. The others followed. They broke through a tangle of plants and shrubs and came out on an open path. Nothing was in sight but Dr. Paul suddenly struck his hands together. "Why, you asses," he cried, "it's the zoo." As they were looking round wildly for any trace of their wild quarry, a keeper in uniform came running along the path with a man in plain clothes. "Has it come this way?" gasped the keeper. "Has what?" asked Syme. "The elephant," cried the keeper. "An elephant has gone mad and run away." "He has run away with an old gentleman," said the other stranger, breathlessly, "a poor old gentleman with white hair." "What sort of old gentleman?" asked Syme, with great curiosity. "A very large and fat old gentleman in light grey clothes," said the keeper eagerly. "Well," said Syme, "if he's that particular kind of old gentleman, if you're quite sure that he's a large and fat old gentleman in grey clothes, you may take my word for it that the elephant has not run away with him. He has run away with the elephant. The elephant is not made by God that could run away with him if he did not consent to the elopement. And, by thunder, there he is." There was no doubt about it this time. Clean across the space of grass, about 200 yards away, with a crowd screaming and scampering vainly at his heels, went a huge grey elephant at an awful stride, with his trunk thrown out as rigid as a ship's bowsprit, and trumpeting like the trumpet of doom. On the back of the bellowing and plunging animal sat President Sunday with all the placidity of a sultan, but goading the animal to a furious speed with some sharp object in his hand. "Stop him!" screamed the populace. "He'll be out of the gate." "Stop a landslide," said the keeper. "He is out of the gate." And evening as he spoke, a final crash and roar of terror announced that the great grey elephant had broken out of the gates of the Zoological Gardens, and was careening down Albany Street like a new and swift sort of omnibus. "Great Lord!" cried Bull, "I never knew an elephant could go so fast." "Well, it must be hansom cabs again if we are to keep him in sight." As they raced along to the gate out of which the elephant had vanished, Syme felt a glaring panorama of the strange animals in the cages which they passed. Afterwards he thought it queer that he should have seen them so clearly. He remembered especially seeing pelicans with their preposterous pendant throats. He wondered why the pelican was the symbol of charity, except it was that it wanted a good deal of charity to admire a pelican. He remembered a hornbill, which was simply a huge yellow beak with a small bird tied on behind it. The whole gave him a sensation, the vividness of which he could not explain, that nature was always making quite mysterious jokes. Sunday had told them that they would understand him when they had understood the stars. He wondered whether evening the archangels understood the hornbill. The 6 unhappy detectives flung themselves into cabs and followed the elephant, sharing the terror which he spread through the long stretch of the streets. This time Sunday did not turn round, but offered them the solid stretch of his unconscious back, which maddened them, if possible, more than his previous mockeries. Just before they came to Baker Street, however, he was seen to throw something far up into the air, as a boy does a ball, meaning to catch it again, but at their rate of racing it fell far behind, just by the cab containing Gogol, and in faint hope of a clue or for some impulse unexplainable, he stopped his cab so as to pick it up. It was addressed to himself, and was quite a bulky parcel. On examination, however, its bulk was found to consist of 33 pieces of paper of no value wrapped one round the other. When the last covering was torn away, it reduced itself to a small slip of paper, on which was written the word, "I fancy should be pink." The man once known as Gogol said nothing, but the movements of his hands and feet were like those of a man urging a horse to renewed efforts. Through street after street, through district after district, went the prodigy of the flying elephant, calling crowds to every window and driving the traffic left and right. And still through all this insane publicity the three cabs toiled after it until they came to be regarded as part of a procession and perhaps the advertisement of a circus. They went at such a rate that distances were shortened beyond belief, and Syme saw the Albert Hall in Kensington when he thought that he was still in Paddington. The animal's pace was evening more fast and free through the empty, aristocratic streets of South Kensington, and he finally headed towards that part of the skyline where the enormous wheel of Earl's Court stood up in the sky. The wheel grew larger and larger till it filled heaven like the wheel of stars. The beast outstripped the cabs. They lost him round several corners, and when they came to one of the gates of the Earl's Court exhibition they found themselves finally blocked. In front of them was an enormous crowd. In the amid of it was an enormous elephant heaving and shuddering as such shapeless creatures do. But the president had disappeared. Where has he gone to? Asked Syme, slipping to the ground. Gentlemen rushed into the exhibition, sir, said an official in a dazed manner. Then he added in an injured voice, funny gentleman, sir, asked me to hold his horse and gave me this. He held out with distaste a piece of folded paper addressed to the Secretary of the Central Anarchist Council. The secretary, raging, rent it open and found written inside it, when the herring runs a mile, let the secretary smile. When the herring tries to fly, let the secretary die. Rustic proverb. Why the eternal crikey, began the secretary. Did you let the man in? Do people commonly come to your exhibition riding on mad elephants? Do. Look, shouted Syme suddenly. Look over there. Look at what? Asked the secretary savagely. Look at the captive balloon, said Syme, and pointed in a frenzy. Why the blazes should I look at a captive balloon? Demanded the secretary. What is there queer about a captive balloon? Nothing, said Syme, except that it isn't captive. They all turned their eyes to where the balloon swung and swelled above the exhibition on a string, like a child's balloon. A second afterwards, the string came in two just under the car, and the balloon, broken loose, floated away with the freedom of a soap bubble. 10,000 devils, shrieked the secretary. He's got into it. And he shook his fists at the sky. The balloon, borne by some chance wind, came right above them, and they could see the great white head of the president peering over the side and looking benevolently down on them. God bless my soul, said the professor with the elderly manner that he could never disconnect from his bleached beard and parchment face. God bless my soul, I seemed to fancy that something fell on the top of my hat. He put up a trembling hand and took from that shelf a piece of twisted paper, which he opened absently only to find it inscribed with a true lover's knot and the words, Your beauty has not left me indifferent. From little Snowdrop. There was a short silence, and then Syme said, biting his beard, I'm not beaten yet. The blasted thing must come down somewhere. Chapter 14. The Six Philosophers. Across green fields and breaking through blooming hedges, toiled six draggled detectives about 5 miles out of London. The optimist of the party had at first proposed that they should follow the balloon across South England in hansom cabs, but he was ultimately convinced of the persistent refusal of the balloon to follow the roads, and the still more persistent refusal of the cabmen to follow the balloon. Consequently, the tireless, though exasperated travelers broke through black thickets and plowed through plowed fields till each was turned into a figure too outrageous to be mistaken for a tramp. Those green hills of Surrey saw the final collapse and tragedy of the admirable light grey suit in which Syme had set out from Saffron Park. His silk hat was broken over his nose by a swinging bough, his coat-tails were torn to the shoulder by arresting thorns, the clay of England was splashed up to his collar, but he still carried his yellow beard forward with a silent and furious determination, and his eyes were still fixed on that floating ball of gas, which in the full flush of sunset seemed colored like a sunset cloud. After all, he said, it is very beautiful. It is singularly and strangely beautiful, said the professor. I wish the beastly gas bag would burst. No, said Dr. Bull, I hope it won't. It may hurt the old boy. Hurt him, said the vindictive professor. Hurt him. Not as much as I'd hurt him if I could get up with him. Little Snowdrop, I don't want him hurt, somehow, said Dr. Bull. What? Cried the secretary bitterly. Do you believe all that tale about his being our man in the dark room? Sunday would say he was a body. I don't know whether I believe it or not, said Dr. Bull. But it isn't that I mean. I can't wish old Sunday's balloon to burst because, well, said Syme impatiently, because he's so jolly like a balloon himself, said Dr. Paul, desperately. I don't understand a word of all that idea of his being the same man who gave us all our blue cards. It seems to make everything nonsense. But I don't care who knows it. I always had a sympathy for old Sunday himself, wicked as he was, just as if he was a great bouncing baby. How can I explain what my queer sympathy was? It didn't prevent my fighting him like hell. Shall I make it clear if I say that I liked him because he was so fat? You will not, said the secretary. I've got it now, cried Bull. It was because he was so fat and so light, just like a balloon. We always think of fat people as heavy, but he could have danced against a sylph. I see now what I mean. Moderate strength is shown in violence, supreme strength is shown in levity. Was like the old speculations. What would happen if an elephant could leap up in the sky like a grasshopper? Our elephant, said Syme, looking upwards, has leapt into the sky like a grasshopper. And somehow, concluded Bull, that's why I can't help liking old Sunday. No, it's not an admiration of force or any silly thing like that. There is a kind of gaiety in the thing, as if you were bursting with some good news. Haven't you sometimes felt it on a spring day? You know nature plays tricks, but somehow that day proves they are good-natured tricks. I never read the Bible myself, but that part they laugh at is literal truth. Why leap ye high hills? The hills do leap, at least. They try to. Why do I like Sunday? How can I tell you? Because he's such a bounder. There was a long silence, and then the secretary said in a curious, strained voice, You do not know Sunday at all. Perhaps it is because you are better than I and do not know hell. I was a fierce fellow and a trifle morbid from the first. The man who sits in darkness, and who chose us all, chose me because I had all the crazy look of a conspirator, because my smile went crooked, and my eyes were gloomy, evening when I smiled. But there must have been something in me that answered to the nerves in all these anarchic men, for when I first saw Sunday he expressed to me, not your airy vitality, but something both gross and sad in the nature of things. I found him smoking in a twilight room, a room with brown blind, down, infinitely more depressing than the genial darkness in which our master lives. He sat there on a bench, a huge heap of a man, dark and out of shape. He listened to all my words without speaking or even stirring. I poured out my most passionate appeals and asked my most eloquent questions. Then, after a long silence, the thing began to shake, and I thought it was shaken by some secret malady. It shook like a loathsome and living jelly. It reminded me of everything I had ever read about the base bodies that are the origin of life, the deep sea, lumps and protoplasm. It seemed like the final form of matter, the most shapeless and the most shameful. I could only tell myself, from its shudderings, that it was something at least that such a monster could be miserable. And then it broke upon me that the bestial mountain was shaking with a lonely laughter, and the laughter was at me. Do you ask me to forgive him that? It is no small thing to be laughed at by something at once lower and stronger than oneself. Surely you fellows are exaggerating wildly, cut in the clear voice of Inspector Ratcliffe. President Sunday is a terrible fellow for one's intellect, but he is not such a Barnum's freak physically as you make out. He received me in an ordinary office, in a grey check coat, in broad daylight. He talked to me in an ordinary way, but I'll tell you what is a trifle creepy about Sunday. His room is neat, his clothes are neat, everything seems in order, but he's absent-minded. Sometimes his great bright eyes go quite blind. For hours he forgets that you are there. Now absent-mindedness is just a bit too awful in a bad man. We think of a wicked man as vigilant. We can't think of a wicked man who is honestly and sincerely dreamy, because we daren't think of a wicked man alone with himself. An absent-minded man means a good-natured man. It means a man who, if he happens to see you, will apologize. But how will you bear an absent-minded man who, if he happens to see you, will kill you? That is what tries the nerves, abstraction combined with cruelty. Men have felt it sometimes when they went through wild forests, and felt that the animals there were at once innocent and pitiless. They may ignore or slay. How would you like to pass 10 mortal hours in a parlor with an absent-minded tiger? And what do you think of Sunday, Gogol? Asked Syme. I don't think of Sunday on principle, said Gogol simply, any more than I stare at the sun at noonday. Well, that is a point of view, said Syme thoughtfully. What do you say, Professor? The professor was walking with bent head and trailing stick, and he did not answer at all. Wake up, Professor, said Syme genially. Tell us what you think of Sunday. The professor spoke at last very slowly. I think something, he said, that I cannot say clearly. Or, rather, I think something that I cannot even think clearly. But it is something like this. My early life, as you know, was a bit too large and loose. Well, when I saw Sunday's face I thought it was too large, everybody does, but I also thought it was too loose. The face was so big, that one couldn't focus it or make it a face at all. The eye was so far away from the nose that it wasn't an eye. The mouth was so much by itself that one had to think of it by itself. The whole thing is too hard to explain. He paused for a little, still trailing his stick, and then went on. But put it this way, walking up a road at night, I have seen a lamp and a lighted window and a cloud make together a most complete and unmistakable face. If anyone in heaven has that face, I shall know him again. Yet when I walked a little farther I found that there was no face, that the window was 10 yards away, the lamp 10 yards, the cloud beyond the world. Well, Sunday's face escaped me. It ran away, to right and left, as such chance pictures run away. And so his face has made me, somehow, doubt whether there are any faces. I don't know whether your face, Bull, is a face or a combination in perspective. Perhaps one black disk of your beastly glasses is quite close, and another 50 miles away. Oh, the doubts of a materialist are not worth a dump. Sunday has taught me the last and the worst doubts, the doubts of a spiritualist. I am a Buddhist, I suppose, and Buddhism is not a creed, it is a doubt. My poor dear Bull, I do not believe that you really have a face. I have not faith enough to believe in matter. Syme's eyes were still fixed upon the errant orb, which, reddened in the evening light, looked like some rosier and more innocent world. Have you noticed an odd thing, he said, about all your descriptions? Each man of you finds Sunday quite different, yet each man of you can only find one thing to compare him to, the universe itself. Paul finds him like the earth in spring, Gogol like the sun at noonday. The secretary is reminded of the shapeless protoplasm, and the inspector of the carelessness of virgin forests. The professor says he is like a ski. This is queer. but it is queer still that I also have had my odd notion about the president, and I also find that I think of Sunday as I think of the whole world. Get on a little faster, Sime, said Bull. Never mind the balloon. When I first saw Sunday, said Sime slowly, I only saw his back, and when I saw his back, I knew he was the worst man in the world. His neck and shoulders were brutal, like those of some apish god. His head had a stoop that was hardly human, like the stoop of an ox. In fact, I had at once the revolting fancy that this was not a man at all, but a beast, dressed up in men's clothes. Get on, said Dr. Bull, and then the queer thing happened. I had seen his back from the street, as he sat in the balcony. Then I entered the hotel, and coming round the other side of him, saw his face in the sunlight. His face frightened me, as it did every one, but not because it was brutal, not because it was evil. On the contrary, it frightened me because it was so beautiful, because it was so good. Sime, exclaimed the secretary, are you ill? It was like the face of some ancient archangel, judging justly after heroic wars. There was laughter in the eyes, and in the mouth honor and sorrow. There was the same white hair, the same great, grey-clad shoulders that I had seen from behind. But when I saw him from behind I was certain he was an animal, and when I saw him in front I knew he was a god. Pan, said the professor dreamily, was a god and an animal. Then, and again and always, went on Sime like a man talking to himself. That has been for me the mystery of Sunday, and it is also the mystery of the world. When I see the horrible back, I am sure the noble face is but a mask. When I see the face but for an instant, I know the back is only a jest. Bad is so bad that we cannot but think good an accident. Good is so good that we feel certain that evil could be explained. But the whole came to a kind of crest yesterday, when I raced Sunday for the cab and was just behind him all the way. Had you time for thinking then? Asked Ratcliffe. Time, replied Sime, for one outrageous thought. I was suddenly possessed with the idea that the blind, blank back of his head really was his face, an awful, eyeless face staring at me, and I fancied that the figure running in front of me was really a figure running backwards and dancing as he ran. Horrible, said Dr. Bull, and shuddered. Horrible is not the word, said Sime. It was exactly the worst instant of my life, and yet 10 minutes afterwards, when he put his head out of the cab and made a grimace like a gargoyle, I knew that he was only like a father playing hide-and-seek with his children. It is a long game, said the secretary, and frowned at his broken boots. Listen to me, cried Sime with extraordinary emphasis. Shall I tell you the secret of the whole world? It is that we have only known the back of the world. We see everything from behind, and it looks brutal. That is not a tree, but the back of a tree. That is not a cloud, but the back of a cloud. Cannot you see that everything is stooping and hiding a face? If we could only get round in front. Look, cried out Bull clamorously, the balloon is coming down. There was no need to cry out to Sime, who had never taken his eyes off it. He saw the great luminous globe suddenly stagger in the sky, right itself, and then sink slowly behind the trees like a setting sun. The man called Gogol, who had hardly spoken through all their weary travels, suddenly threw up his hands like a lost spirit. He is dead, he cried, and now I know he was my friend in the dark. Dead, snorted the secretary. You will not find him dead easily. He has been tipped out of the car. We shall find him rolling as a colt rolls in a field, kicking his legs for fun, clashing his hoofs, said the professor. The colts do, and so did Pan. Pan again, said Dr. Bull irritably. You seem to think Pan is everything. So he is, said the professor, in Greek. He means everything. Don't forget, said the secretary, looking down, that he also means panic. Sime had stood without hearing any of the exclamations. It fell over there, he said shortly. Let us follow it. Then he added with an indescribable gesture, oh, if he has cheated us all by getting killed, it would be like one of his larks. He strode off towards the distant trees with a new energy, his rags and ribbons fluttering in the wind. The others followed him in a more footsore and dubious manner, and almost at the same moment all 6 men realized that they were not alone in the little field. Across the square of turf a tall man was advancing towards them, leaning on a strange long staff like a scepter. He was clad in a fine but old-fashioned suit with knee breeches. Its color was that shade between blue, violet, and gray which can be seen in certain shadows of the woodland. His hair was whitish gray, and at the first glance, taken along with his knee breeches, looked as if it was powdered. His advance was very quiet, but for the silver frost upon his head he may have been one to the shadows of the wood. Gentlemen, he said, my master has a carriage waiting for you in the road just by. Who is your master? Asked Syme, standing quite still. I was told you knew his name, said the man respectfully. There was a silence, and then the secretary said, where is this carriage? It has been waiting only a few moments, said the stranger. My master has only just come home. Syme looked left and right upon the patch of green field in which he found himself. The hedges were ordinary hedges, the trees seemed ordinary trees, yet he felt like a man entrapped in fairyland. He looked the mysterious ambassador up and down, but he could discover nothing except that the man's coat was the exact color of the purple shadows, and that the man's face was the exact color of the red and brown and golden sky. Show us the place, Syme said briefly, and without a word the man in the violet coat turned his back and walked towards a gap in the hedge, which let in suddenly the light of a white road. As the 6 wanderers broke out upon this thoroughfare, they saw the white road blocked by what looked like a long row of carriages, such a row of carriages as may close the approach to some house in Park Lane. Along the side of these carriages stood a rank of splendid servants, all dressed in the grey-blue uniform, and all having a certain quality of stateliness and freedom which would not commonly belong to the servants of a gentleman, but rather to the officials and ambassadors of a great king. There were no less than 6 carriages waiting, one for each of the tattered and miserable band. All the attendants, as if in court dress, wore swords, and as each man crawled into his carriage they drew them, and saluted with a sudden blaze of steel. What can it all mean? Asked Bull of Syme as they separated. Is this another joke of Sundays? I don't know, said Syme as he sank wearily back in the cushions of his carriage. But if it is, it's one of the jokes you talk about. It's a good-natured one. The 6 adventurers had passed through many adventures, but not one had carried them so utterly off their feet as this last adventure of comfort. They had all become inured to things going roughly, but things suddenly going smoothly swamped them. They could not even feebly imagine what the carriages were. It was enough for them to know that they were carriages, and carriages with cushions. They could not conceive who the old man was who had led them, but it was quite enough that he had certainly led them to the carriages. Syme drove through a drifting darkness of trees in utter abandonment. It was typical of him that while he had carried his bearded chin forward fiercely so long as anything could be done, when the whole business was taken out of his hands he fell back on the cushions in a frank collapse. Very gradually and very vaguely he realized into what rich roads the carriage was carrying him. He saw that they passed the stone gates of what may have been a park, that they began gradually to climb a hill, which, while wooded on both sides, was somewhat more orderly than a forest. Then there began to grow upon him, as upon a man slowly waking from a healthy sleep, a pleasure in everything. He felt that the hedges were what hedges should be, living walls, that a hedge is like a human army, disciplined, but all the more alive. He saw high elms behind the hedges, and vaguely thought how happy boys would be climbing there. Then, his carriage took a turn of the path, and he saw suddenly and quietly, like a long, low, sunset cloud, a long, low house mellow in the mild light of sunset. All the 6 friends compared notes afterwards and quarreled, but they all agreed that in some unaccountable way the place reminded them of their boyhood. It was either this elm top or that crooked path. It was either this scrap of orchard or that shape of a window. But each man of them declared that he could remember this place before he could remember his mother. When the carriages eventually rolled up to a large, low, cavernous gateway, another man in the same uniform, but wearing a silver star on the gray breast of his coat, came out to meet them. This impressive person said to the bewildered Syme, "Refreshments are provided for you in your room." Syme, under the influence of the same mesmeric sleep of amazement, went up the large oaken stairs after the respectful attendant. He entered a splendid suite of apartments that seemed to be designed specially for him. He walked up to a long mirror with the ordinary instinct of his class to pull his tie straight or to smooth his hair, and there he saw the frightful figure that he was, blood running down his face from where the bough had struck him, his hair standing out like yellow rags of rank grass, his clothes torn into long, wavering tatters. At once the whole enigma sprang up, simply as the question of how he had got there, and how he was to get out again. Exactly at the same moment a man in blue, who had been appointed as his valet, said very solemnly, "I have put out your clothes, sir." "Clothes," said Syme sardonically. "I have no clothes except these," and he lifted 2 long strips of his frock coat in fascinating festoons, and made a movement as if to twirl like a ballet girl. "My master asks me to say," said the attendant, "that there is a fancy dress ball tonight, and that he desires you to put on the costume that I have laid out. Meanwhile, sir, there is a bottle of Burgundy and some cold pheasant, which he hopes you will not refuse, as it is some hours before supper." "Cold pheasant is a good thing," said Syme reflectively, "and Burgundy is a spanking good thing. But really I do not want either of them so much as I want to know what the devil all this means, and what sort of costume you have got laid out for me. Where is it?" The servant lifted off a kind of ottoman a long peacock blue drapery, rather of the nature of a domino, on the front of which was emblazoned a large golden sun, and which was splashed here and there with flaming stars and crescents. "You're to be dressed as Thursday, sir," said the valet somewhat affably. "Dressed as Thursday," said Syme in meditation. "It doesn't sound a warm costume." "Oh, yes, sir," said the other eagerly. "The Thursday costume is quite warm, sir. It fastens up to the chin." "Well, I don't understand anything," said Syme, sighing. "I have been used so long to uncomfortable adventures that comfortable adventures knock me out. Still, I may be allowed to ask why I should be particularly like Thursday in a green frock spotted all over with the sun and moon. Those orbs, I think, shine on other days. I once saw the moon on Tuesday, I remember." "Beg pardon, sir," said the valet. "Bible also provided for you," and with a respectful and rigid finger he pointed out a passage in the first chapter of Genesis. Syme read it wondering. It was that in which the 4th day of the week is associated with the creation of the sun and moon. Here, however, they reckoned from a Christian Sunday. "This is getting wilder and wilder," said Syme, as he sat down in a chair. "Who are these people who provide cold pheasant and Burgundy and green clothes and Bibles? Do they provide everything?" "Yes, sir, everything," said the attendant gravely. "Shall I help you on with your costume?" "Oh, hitch the bally thing on," said Syme impatiently. But though he affected to despise the mummery, he felt a curious freedom and naturalness in his movements as the blue and gold garment fell about him, and when he found that he had to wear a sword, it stirred a boyish Dream. As he passed out of the room, he flung the folds across his shoulder with a gesture. His sword stood out at an angle, and he had all the swagger of a troubadour.